Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is something appropriate about marking your location at the moment you choose to investigate places that supposedly should not exist, communities that persist in the margins of maps and the blind spots of official record. We speak often about H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic entities, his incomprehensible geometries and star-spawned horrors, but we speak less frequently about the human infrastructure required to sustain such nightmares, the cult locations, the hidden congregations, the specific geographic coordinates where ordinary people supposedly gather to worship beings that should annihilate them through mere acknowledgement. Lovecraft populated his fiction with remarkably precise locations: Innsmouth at the mouth of the Manoxet River, the Whately farmhouse in the hills above Dunwich, the basement chamber beneath a Providence boarding house. This geographic specificity was not ornamental, but foundational to his project. He understood that cosmic horror becomes most disturbing when anchored to specific streets, particular coastlines, actual regions one might visit, or inadvertently pass through. What began as a literary device has metastasized into a cultural phenomenon. People now visit these fictional locations, seek evidence of cult activity in real New England towns, debate online which isolated communities might harbor descendants of Lovecraft's imagined congregations. This investigation will examine how Lovecraft constructed his cult geography, why certain locations function as sites of fictional worship, how these literary spaces have been elaborated and expanded by subsequent writers, and most disturbingly, why we remain convinced that somewhere, in forgotten corners of familiar landscapes, such congregations persist beyond the page. We will proceed through 4 movements: the origins of cult location in Lovecraft's imagination and tradition, the specific nature and themes of these spaces, their manifestation in key texts, and their migration from fiction into cultural belief and practice. Howard Phillips Lovecraft required cult locations not merely as atmospheric background, but as structural necessity for making cosmic horror narratively functional within the constraints of commercial fiction. His philosophical commitment to cosmic indifferentism, the position that humanity occupies no privileged place in a mechanistic universe, created immediate storytelling problems when translated into pulp magazine format. How does one write a compelling narrative about entities so alien that human comprehension is impossible and human action is meaningless? The solution Lovecraft developed involved creating intermediary spaces and human organizations that bridge the gap between cosmic abstraction and readable plot. Cult locations served this function perfectly. They were specific enough to investigate, human enough to comprehend, yet strange enough to suggest connections to forces beyond normal understanding. A protagonist could travel to Innsmouth, observe its peculiar architecture and degenerate population, interview its disturbed residents, and through accumulated evidence, gradually approach cosmic revelation without confronting it directly until narrative climax. The early 20th century American context shaped how Lovecraft imagined these cult spaces and what anxieties they encoded. The period from 1900 through the 1930s saw massive immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, rapid urbanization transforming traditional communities, and widespread cultural anxiety about foreign religious and social practices supposedly threatening Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominance. Lovecraft himself harbored well-documented xenophobic attitudes that infected his fiction, particularly in earlier works. His cult locations often appeared in immigrant neighborhoods, ethnic enclaves, or communities described as racially degenerate or hybrid. The Louisiana swamp cult in The Call of Cthulhu consists largely of mongrels and non-Anglo participants. Innsmouth's population shows evidence of interbreeding with non-human entities, described through language uncomfortably paralleling contemporary eugenics discourse. We must acknowledge these elements while recognizing that the cult location concept transcends its problematic origins. The idea of hidden communities worshipping alien entities has proven adaptable to various cultural contexts and ideological frameworks beyond Lovecraft's specific prejudices. Lovecraft's voluminous correspondence reveals deliberate construction of what he called his New England legendary, a comprehensive mythology rooted in specific regional geography that readers could theoretically visit. In letters to fellow writers like Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and August Derleth, Lovecraft discussed creating interconnected cult locations that would gain credibility through repeated reference across multiple stories by different authors. He provided maps, detailed descriptions of invented Massachusetts towns, and genealogies of cult families, encouraging his correspondents to incorporate these locations into their own weird fiction. This collaborative approach transformed personal literary creation into something resembling genuine folklore, stories from multiple sources, all referencing the same places, creating the illusion of independent verification. The technique worked remarkably well. Readers began asking Arkham House publishers for directions to Arkham or Innsmouth, and New England historical societies received inquiries about events Lovecraft had invented. The pulp fiction market of the 1920s and 1930s established conventions that influenced how Lovecraft deployed cult locations within narrative structure. Magazines like Weird Tales required stories with enough action and investigation to sustain reader interest across 20 to 30 pages while working within strict word count and content guidelines. Editors preferred exotic or isolated settings that immediately signaled departure from mundane reality. Readers expected weird fiction to transport them to strange places. Lovecraft satisfied this expectation while subverting it. His cult locations appeared exotic and isolated, but were actually disturbingly close to readers' ordinary experience. Innsmouth lay just off Route 1A in Massachusetts. The Whately farm occupied remote but accessible Vermont hill country. Arkham functioned as normal university town with abnormal secrets. This proximity made the horror more intimate. These cults did not operate in distant jungles or ancient ruins, but in New England, in America, in places readers might drive through on vacation. Consider also how actual newspaper sensationalism influenced Lovecraft's cult geography. The 1920s saw considerable press attention to various cult panics, from continuing aftermath of the 1692 Salem witch trials in popular memory to contemporary reports about spiritualist frauds, satanic ritual rumors, and occasional genuine religious communities whose practices seemed bizarre to mainstream observers. Lovecraft was an avid newspaper reader who collected accounts of unusual crimes, archaeological discoveries, and scientific anomalies that might serve as story material. He transformed journalistic reports about isolated religious communities, inbred rural populations, or mysterious disappearances into narrative elements suggesting cult activity. The technique created verisimilitude, His fictional cults resembled things that had actually made headlines, differing only in supernatural elements readers could not definitively disprove. The paradox embedded in Lovecraft's cult location project deserves emphasis. He sought to create secret places through the most public medium available, published fiction in widely distributed magazines. Every story that depicted a hidden cult simultaneously revealed that cult to thousands of readers, transforming the secret into shared cultural knowledge. Yet this apparent contradiction actually enhanced, rather than diminished, the cult location concept's power. Lovecraft recognized that effective secrets are not entirely unknown, but rather partially known, whispered about, documented in fragmentary ways that leave room for speculation and dread. His fictional approach to cult locations mimicked how actual conspiracy theories and urban legends function. Enough detail to seem credible, enough ambiguity to permit imagination to expand the horror beyond what the text explicitly states. The concept of cults persisting in secret locations reaches back through centuries of European and American cultural memory, drawing on anxieties about hidden religious practices that predate Christianity or survive its dominance through concealment and adaptation. British anthropologist Margaret Murray published The Witch Cult in Western Europe in 1921, arguing controversially that medieval and early modern witch trials targeted not diabolic practitioners, but surviving members of pre-Christian fertility religions that had gone underground to escape persecution. Murray's thesis, though largely discredited by subsequent scholarship, achieved enormous popular influence during the 1920s and 1930s, precisely when Lovecraft was developing his cult mythology. The idea that organized pagan worship continued secretly for centuries, passed down through families and isolated communities, transmitted rituals and beliefs incompatible with dominant Christian culture, provided a historical framework that made fictional cult persistence seem plausible. Lovecraft adapted Murray's model, replacing hypothetical fertility cults with congregations worshipping cosmic entities, but retaining the structure of multi-generational secret transmission, isolated meeting locations, and practices that would horrify mainstream society if discovered. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, established an influential model for how esoteric knowledge supposedly circulates through secret networks of initiated individuals. Theosophy proposed that ancient wisdom traditions, originating in lost civilizations like Atlantis, or preserved by hidden masters in remote locations like Tibet, continued to exist alongside, but separate from conventional religion and science, accessible only to those who underwent proper initiation and study. This organizational model influenced numerous occult groups proliferating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn to Aleister Crowley's various magical orders. These organizations typically claimed to preserve knowledge from ancient sources, met in specific consecrated locations, required elaborate initiation rituals, and maintained hierarchical structures distinguishing novices from adepts. Lovecraft's fictional cults mirrored this organizational pattern. The Esoteric Order of Dagon in Innsmouth, the Starry Wisdom sect in Providence, various unnamed congregations throughout his fiction, all operate according to principles resembling actual occult societies, rather than conventional churches or straightforward devil worship. Freemasonry and similar fraternal organizations generated considerable American anxiety about secret societies precisely because they combined mundane social functions with mysterious rituals conducted in specific consecrated spaces. Masonic lodges occupied identifiable buildings in most American towns by the early 20th century, the architecture often incorporating esoteric symbolism visible to passers-by who could not access the ritual spaces within. The organizations claimed ancient origins, employed elaborate degree systems, required oaths of secrecy from members, and operated according to constitutions and bylaws outsiders could not examine. Anti-Masonic political movements between the 1820s and 1830s and recurring anti-Masonic sentiment throughout the 19th century reflected widespread suspicion that these organizations wielded inappropriate political influence through secretive coordination. Lovecraft adapted Masonic models when constructing his fictional cults. They, too, occupied specific buildings, maintained hierarchies and degrees of initiation, required oaths and secrecy, and supposedly influenced local politics and economics. The difference was that Lovecraft's cults worshipped entities that actually were dangerous rather than merely seeming suspicious to paranoid outsiders. The Salem witch trials of 1692 established New England, Lovecraft's home region, as location fundamentally associated with hidden evil and secret congregations. The trials occurred in Essex County, Massachusetts, exactly where Lovecraft would later situate Innsmouth. They involved accusations that ordinary community members had entered into secret covenants with diabolic forces, gathering at midnight in remote locations to worship Satan and plot against godly society. The historical record shows how quickly accusation could spread through communities, how neighbors could be revealed as secret practitioners of forbidden rites, how respectable citizens might harbor terrible secrets. This historical precedent made Lovecraft's cult locations psychologically plausible to readers familiar with New England history. If it had happened before in Salem, why not again in fictional Arkham or Kingsport? The witch trials also established the pattern of official intervention coming too late or proving inadequate. By the time authorities recognized the scope of supposed conspiracy, the diabolic worship had already spread throughout the community. Lovecraft would replay this pattern in stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth, where federal raids occur only after generations of cult activity have transformed an entire town. The concept of the American frontier as space of lawlessness and alternative communities contributed significantly to how Lovecraft imagined cult locations persisting beyond official surveillance. Throughout the 19th century, various religious and social movements established isolated communities in remote regions where they could practice beliefs unacceptable in mainstream society. Mormon settlements before Utah statehood, Oneida communities experiment in complex marriage, various utopian socialist communes, religious sects practicing unusual rituals. Some of these communities genuinely sought positive alternatives to conventional society. Others proved genuinely dangerous or exploitative, but all demonstrated that geographic isolation could permit practices that would be prohibited or suppressed in more accessible locations. Lovecraft's rural cult sites, the Whately Farm in the Dunwich Hills, various unnamed settlements in Vermont mountains or Massachusetts woodlands, draw on this tradition of frontier isolation enabling alternative lifeways. The cults persist not necessarily because they are supernaturally protected, but because they occupy geographic and social margins where official authority rarely penetrates. Spiritualism and seance culture, which flourished from the 1850s through the 1920s, normalized the idea that certain locations enabled contact with non-physical entities and that such contact required specific ritualized conditions. Spiritualist societies met regularly in particular buildings or homes, created consecrated spaces through ritual preparation, and believed that geographic factors, electromagnetic fields, proximity to water, presence of psychically sensitive individuals affected success in contacting spirits. This cultural context made Lovecraft's cult locations seem less fantastical. If mainstream spiritualists accepted that deceased humans could be contacted at specific locations through proper ritual, why couldn't more dangerous entities be reached through similar means? The difference was one of degree rather than kind. Lovecraft's genius was recognizing that spiritualism's cultural acceptance of location-specific supernatural contact could be extended to much darker purposes, that the same framework explaining grandmother's voice emanating from a medium's mouth could explain tentacled monstrosities responding to cultist invocation. Anthropological accounts of indigenous and primitive religious practices, widely published in academic journals and popular magazines during Lovecraft's lifetime, provided detailed descriptions of how non-Western cultures supposedly worshipped forces that Christian observers considered demonic or degraded. These accounts, often deeply problematic in their colonial assumptions and cultural misunderstanding, typically emphasize secret societies, initiation rites conducted in hidden locations, worship of entities represented by disturbing idols, and ritual practices involving sacrifice or sexual elements considered taboo in Western society. Lovecraft drew extensively on such anthropological writing, particularly when depicting the Louisiana swamp cult in The Call of Cthulhu, or the Polynesian practices supposedly introduced to Innsmouth by Captain Obed Marsh. The academic authority of anthropology lent credibility to his fictional cults. If scholarly observers had documented similar practices in Africa, Polynesia, or South America, readers might accept that comparable cults could exist in rural America or other locations where different cultures intersected. These multiple cultural and philosophical antecedents, witch cult theories, occult societies, Masonic organizations, historical witch trials, frontier isolation, spiritualist practice, and anthropological reports converged to create an intellectual environment where Lovecraft's fictional cult locations felt culturally plausible rather than purely fantastical. He synthesized existing anxieties, historical precedents, and contemporary occult practices into something distinctly his own, but the building blocks came from recognizable traditions that readers had encountered in various forms throughout their lives. The word cult itself carries layered meanings that Lovecraft exploited to maximum effect when constructing his geography of forbidden worship. Derived from Latin cultus, the term originally signified cultivation or tending, agricultural labor applied to land, devotional attention paid to gods, the careful maintenance of relationships with forces beyond human control. This etymological root connects worship to specific places in fundamental ways. One cultivates particular fields, tends specific groves, builds shrines at designated locations. The agricultural metaphor suggests that cult activity, like farming, depends on working with the inherent properties of specific geography. Certain soil grows certain crops. Certain locations enable certain forms of worship. Lovecraft's cult locations function according to this principle. They are not arbitrary meeting places, but sites chosen or discovered because their geographic properties facilitate contact with cosmic entities. Innsmouth's coastal position enables deep one, worship, and interbreeding. Dunwich's isolated hills provide concealment for rituals that would be impossible in populated areas. The cultivation metaphor also implies ongoing labor across time. Cults must be maintained generation after generation, their practices and locations preserved through deliberate transmission. Geographic terminology throughout Lovecraft's work emphasizes threshold spaces, locations positioned between different states or realms where boundaries become permeable or ambiguous. Coastlines separate land from ocean, serving as literal thresholds where human civilization meets vast aquatic unknown. Lovecraft situates multiple cult locations at coastal sites: Innsmouth, Kingsport, the Pacific Island, where a relay temporarily surfaces. Mountains function as vertical thresholds, elevating cult sites above mundane lowlands while remaining below cosmic heights. The Whately Farm occupies liminal space between valley civilization and mountain wilderness. Swamps and marshlands represent threshold between solid earth and water, neither fully one nor the other, places where normal geographic categories break down. The anthropological term liminal, from Latin limen, meaning threshold, describes these in-between spaces that feature prominently in ritual practice across cultures. Liminal geography in Lovecraft's work suggests that cult locations naturally arise where conventional boundaries weaken, where the membrane separating normal reality from cosmic horror grows thin enough to permit dangerous commerce. The language of secrecy Lovecraft employs, hidden, forgotten, forbidden, overlooked, unknown, transforms ordinary adjectives into markers of cult significance. A hidden valley is not merely difficult to find, but deliberately concealed, suggesting agency behind its obscurity. Forgotten towns are not simply depopulated, but erased from memory through processes that might be supernatural rather than demographic. Forbidden sites carry linguistic weight beyond simple prohibition. They are forbidden by whom, for what reasons, and what happens to those who violate the interdiction. The word overlooked performs particularly interesting work. It can mean either viewed from above or failed to notice, creating ambiguity about whether cult locations escape attention through their own properties or through observer failure. This semantic flexibility allows Lovecraft to suggest, without confirming, that cult sites possess qualities making them difficult to perceive or remember correctly. The reader cannot determine whether investigators miss cult evidence through human error or because the locations themselves resist documentation. Lovecraft's invented place names demonstrate sophisticated understanding of toponymy, the study of how locations acquire names and what those names reveal. He created Arkham, Dunwich, Innsmouth, and Kingsport as names that sound authentically New England through careful attention to regional naming patterns. Many Massachusetts towns end in Ham, Needham, Dedham, Waltham, or Mouth, Plymouth, Weymouth, Exmouth, typically indicating Anglo-Saxon origins. The suffix wich or wick appears in Ipswich and Greenwich, deriving from Old English terms for settlement or dwelling. Lovecraft's invented names deploy these authentic elements while remaining unfindable on actual maps, creating the uncanny effect of places that should exist based on naming conventions but somehow do not. The technique makes readers question their geographic knowledge. Perhaps Arkham does exist, and they simply haven't encountered it. Perhaps Innsmouth appears on older maps that predate its mysterious decline. The names feel more real than obviously invented terms like Demon Valley or Witch Town would, precisely because they follow authentic patterns rather than theatrical obviousness. Place name etymology in Lovecraft's work often gestures toward pre-colonial indigenous origins, suggesting that cult significance predates European settlement and persists beneath Anglo-American place names. He references Aboriginal legends and Indian traditions about certain locations, implying that native populations recognized and avoided sites that white settlers foolishly occupied. This layering of geographic nomenclature, indigenous names lost or corrupted, colonial names masking older significance, creates temporal depth, suggesting cult locations possess meaning transcending current cultural interpretation. The technique reflects actual American toponymy, where indigenous names survive in distorted form, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Mississippi, or disappear entirely beneath colonial replacement. Lovecraft exploits this historical pattern to suggest that current maps and gazetteers might systematically obscure cult locations through naming conventions that erase their true significance or prehistoric associations. The vocabulary of isolation, remote, inaccessible, overlooked, bypassed, forgotten, constructs cult geography through absence rather than presence. These terms emphasize what cult locations lack. They lack population density, lack road access, lack official attention, lack appearance on tourist itineraries. This negative definition proves remarkably effective for creating horror, since it positions cult sites as voids or blank spaces in otherwise comprehensible geographic frameworks. A remote location is defined by its distance from centers, an inaccessible site by barriers preventing easy approach, an overlooked town by its absence from normal awareness. Lovecraft understood that horror often functions most effectively through subtraction. Removing expected features creates more unease than adding overtly frightening elements. His cult locations horrify partly through what they lack. They lack the safety of civilization, the documentation of official record, the banality of normal American towns. They exist as negative spaces where expected geographic features disappear, creating vacuums that cosmic horror fills. Mapping terminology throughout Lovecraft's work, uncharted, unmapped, incorrectly surveyed, suggests that cult locations resist accurate cartographic representation. Maps supposedly show blank spaces where cult towns should appear, or place them in wrong positions, or fail to update their status from thriving community to abandoned ruin. This linguistic framework draws on actual cartographic history. Many regions remained incompletely mapped into the 20th century. Official surveys contained errors. Isolated communities escaped comprehensive documentation. Lovecraft exploits these factual gaps to suggest that some locations evade mapping through properties beyond simple geographic oversight. Perhaps cult sites actively resist cartographic capture, warping surveying equipment, or confusing cartographers. Perhaps maps correctly record their positions, but human memory fails to retain the information, so readers repeatedly forget where Innsmouth lies, despite consulting maps that clearly mark it. The ambiguity between cartographic failure and supernatural resistance creates productive uncertainty about whether cult geography operates according to normal spatial principles. Religious language repurposed from Christian terminology, Congregation, covenant, ritual, communion, devotion applies familiar frameworks to utterly alien worship. This linguistic appropriation makes cult activity comprehensible through analogy, while suggesting that the analogy breaks down upon closer examination. A congregation gathers for worship, but what happens when worship targets entities that regard humans as insects? A covenant establishes mutual obligations, but what can humans offer beings that exist across dimensions? The familiar terms become uncanny through misapplication, revealing that our religious vocabulary assumes worship relationships between comparable entities, humans, and anthropomorphic gods, rather than insects addressing forces that barely register their existence. Lovecraft's strategic deployment of conventional religious terminology exposes the inadequacy of that terminology for describing cosmic horror, while simultaneously making cult activity feel simultaneously familiar and wrong. This careful attention to etymology, toponymy, and symbolic language created cult geography that felt authentic precisely through its attention to how places are actually named, described, and understood. Lovecraft did not invent transparent fantasy names, but rather employed subtle linguistic strategies that made his cult locations seem like they should exist within actual geographic frameworks, creating cognitive dissonance between reader knowledge that these places are fictional and reader intuition that they feel real. Having established the linguistic architecture through which Lovecraft constructed cult locations, we must now examine the specific narrative techniques he employed to make these fictional geographies achieve the texture of recovered historical truth rather than invented fantasy. Lovecraft's technique of embedding cult locations within meticulously researched historical contexts represents his most sophisticated strategy for achieving mythological authenticity. He did not place his fictional cults in vague New England, but rather situated them with bureaucratic precision. Arkham lay in Essex County, Massachusetts. Miskatonic University was founded in 1690. The esoteric order of Dagon maintained headquarters at a specific street address in Innsmouth. This geographic and temporal specificity forced readers to engage with cult locations as they would actual places, consulting maps to verify positions, checking historical records to confirm founding dates, visiting regions Lovecraft described to assess accuracy of his architectural and topographic details. The strategy succeeded brilliantly. Correspondence to Arkham House publishers included letters asking for directions to Arkham, and New England tourism offices fielded inquiries about Lovecraft's invented towns. By surrounding fictional locations with verifiable real geography, Providence, Boston, Newburyport, Lovecraft created context where the fictional elements seemed like gaps in reader knowledge rather than authorial invention. If all these other Massachusetts towns existed as described, why not Arkham and Innsmouth as well? The creation of fake documentation supporting cult existence proved essential to Lovecraft's authenticity project. His stories reference newspaper accounts that never appeared in actual papers, police records that exist in no archive, academic studies published in invented journals. The Call of Cthulhu cites specific dates and locations for Inspector Legrasse's raid on the Louisiana cult, providing sufficient detail that readers might believe the events actually occurred and simply escaped their personal awareness. The Shadow over Innsmouth mentions federal raids in 1928, submarine activity off Devil Reef, and government explanations about bootlegging and structural condemnation that supposedly covered the true nature of interventions. These pseudo-documentary references created Hall of Mirrors effect, where fiction gestured toward historical record, while historical record remained conveniently inaccessible to verification. The technique mirrors how conspiracy theories function. They reference classified documents, suppressed reports, and covered-up incidents that cannot be confirmed precisely because they are supposedly hidden. Lovecraft understood that unprovable claims often carry more psychological weight than provable ones, since they cannot be definitively disproven and therefore remain available for imaginative elaboration. Building cult history through multiple interconnected stories across years of publication created cumulative mythology that no single tale could achieve. Arkham first appears in The Picture in the House, 1920, gains its university in Herbert West, Reanimator, 1922, becomes site of witch house geometry in The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, and features as location in numerous other stories over Lovecraft's career. Each appearance added details, street names, building descriptions, historical events, notable residents that subsequent stories could reference, creating self-confirming system where later tales validated earlier ones through citation and expansion. This technique generated the texture of genuine folklore, which similarly accumulates through multiple tellings by different voices over extended time periods. A single story about Arkham might register as invention, but dozens of stories by Lovecraft and his correspondents, all referencing the same geography, history, and cult activity, created the illusion that writers were discovering and documenting rather than inventing. The cumulative effect transformed Arkham from fictional setting into something resembling shared cultural knowledge. The deployment of found documents and recovered manuscripts as framing devices position cult location narratives as recovered historical truth rather than authorial creation. The Call of Cthulhu presents itself as manuscript compiled by Francis Thurston after investigating his uncle's research, incorporating documents the uncle had collected about global cult activity. The Shadow over Innsmouth purports to be narrator's written account of experiences that led to his institutionalization and eventual transformation. At the Mountains of Madness takes the form of scientific expedition report warning against future Antarctic exploration. These framing strategies distance Lovecraft from the narrative, positioning him as editor or publisher of texts with independent existence rather than author creating fiction. The technique has deep roots in Gothic literature. Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, 1764, claimed to be translated medieval manuscript. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, presented itself as correspondence collected and edited, but Lovecraft deployed it with particular attention to cult locations, suggesting that geographic information came from eyewitness accounts and historical documents rather than imaginative invention. Geographic specificity within narratives created believability through verifiable environmental detail that readers could confirm through their own experience or research. Lovecraft's descriptions of New England coastlines, architecture, vegetation, and weather patterns demonstrated intimate knowledge of the region he wrote about. When he described Innsmouth's sagging gambrel roofs, he employed accurate architectural terminology for building style common in colonial Massachusetts. His accounts of tidal patterns, fishing industries, and maritime culture reflected genuine understanding of New England coastal economy. The vegetation, geology, and wildlife he mentioned in rural cult locations matched actual Vermont and Massachusetts ecology. This foundation of verifiable accuracy made unverifiable cult elements seem plausible by association. If Lovecraft correctly described everything else about these locations, perhaps his accounts of cult activity were equally accurate. The technique required significant research. Lovecraft consulted geological surveys, historical records, architectural guides, and conducted extensive walking tours throughout New England to gather the environmental detail that would authenticate his fictional additions. The pattern of local knowledge appearing throughout Lovecraft's cult location stories. Residents who know but will not speak. Witnesses who saw but cannot adequately describe. Communities maintaining deliberate silence created narrative structure explaining why cult information remained fragmentary and unreliable. Investigators repeatedly encounter people who deflect questions, refuse to discuss local history, or provide contradictory accounts that suggest either coordinated deception or genuine cognitive difficulty processing what they have witnessed. This pattern reflects actual experience of oral history research, where community secrets persist through generations of protective silence, where traumatic events resist clear articulation, where different witnesses provide incompatible versions of supposedly shared experiences. By incorporating realistic barriers to information gathering, Lovecraft made his cult locations feel authentic. They were difficult to document, not because he, as author, refused to provide clear information, but because the fictional reality of cult presence created realistic obstacles to investigation. The narrative technique transformed authorial ambiguity into diegetic resistance, making uncertainty feel like feature of cult geography rather than limitation of fiction. Creating cult genealogy through family histories, bloodlines, and multi-generational participation grounded abstract cosmic horror in concrete human biology and social structure. The Marsh family controlled Innsmouth across generations through their covenant with Deep Ones. The Whateleys represented multiple generations of human entity breeding, culminating in Wilbur and his twin. Various other families throughout Lovecraft's fiction, the Bishops, the Hutchinsons, the Wards, carried cult knowledge or contamination across centuries. This genealogical approach to cult persistence reflected actual patterns of how religious and social practices transmit through families, how isolated communities develop distinctive genetic characteristics through limited breeding populations, and how New England aristocracy particularly emphasized lineage and heredity. Lovecraft exploited American fascination with genealogy, a national pastime involving ancestor research, hereditary societies, and family pride, to make cult transmission feel historically grounded. If families could preserve recipes, property, and Protestant denominations across generations, they could presumably also preserve cosmic horror worship and contaminated bloodlines. The newspaper clipping technique, embedding excerpts from actual newspaper sources reporting on mysterious events, provided documentary texture supporting cult location existence. Lovecraft would reference specific dates and publications. The Boston Globe for March 1st, 1925 carries a brief item, or the Providence Journal reported. These citations created fiction of verification, while actual verification remained impossible for most readers who lacked access to newspaper archives and would be unlikely to check even if they possessed such access. The few readers who did verify would discover no such articles existed, but this absence could be explained through Lovecraft's fictional framework. Perhaps the stories were suppressed. Perhaps the archives were incomplete. Perhaps memory of cult events faded from public record through supernatural influence. The newspaper citation technique exploited pre-internet information asymmetry, where claiming documentary evidence carried weight that contemporary readers could not easily challenge. These myth-building techniques, geographic precision, fake documentation, cumulative storytelling, found manuscripts, environmental accuracy, local knowledge patterns, genealogical depth, and newspaper citations worked synergistically to create cult locations that felt discovered rather than invented, documented rather than imagined, persistently real rather than conveniently fictional. Lovecraft understood that effective mythology requires texture, contradiction, and incompleteness, the appearance of genuine history rather than tidy narrative. His cult locations achieved this texture through careful attention to how actual places are known, remembered, and transmitted through culture. Geographic determinism operates as foundational principle throughout Lovecraft's cult location mythology, the concept that certain places naturally attract or enable forbidden worship, not through human choice, but through inherent spatial properties that predate and transcend human occupation. This determinism inverts conventional religious geography, where sacred sites become holy through human designation or divine intervention. Lovecraft's cult locations possess significance independent of human recognition. They were important before humanity existed and will remain important after humanity disappears. The coastline where Innsmouth sits enabled deep one contact for millions of years before Captain Obed Marsh arrived in the 1840s, and would continue enabling such contact if every human vanished tomorrow. The Dunwich Hills contain geometric properties facilitating dimensional breach, regardless of whether the Whately family exploits them. This geographic determinism eliminates human agency from cosmic horror's equation. We do not choose cult locations. We merely discover sites that were always already significant. The philosophical implication cuts deep. If geography itself predisposes certain locations toward cosmic horror, then no amount of human vigilance or intervention can make those places safe, only temporarily unoccupied. Temporal layering distinguishes Lovecraft's cult locations from ordinary geography through the suggestion that these sites exist simultaneously in multiple time periods, that past cult activity leaves residue or resonance, making places permanently different from their surroundings. Innsmouth in 1927 remains haunted by events from the 1840s, but also by deep one presence extending back through geological time. The witch house in Arkham connects to 17th century witchcraft while also accessing timeless dream dimensions. This temporal complexity means cult locations cannot be cleansed through simple intervention. Destroying current cult infrastructure leaves the site's fundamental properties unchanged. Federal agents can raid Innsmouth, demolish its buildings, and arrest its hybrid population, but the coastline retains its geographic relationship to deep one cities, and the bloodlines persist in survivors who escaped or were released. The layering suggests that time operates differently at cult sites, that past and present coexist rather than succeeding each other, that actions taken centuries ago continue reverberating through altered spatial properties. This conception of time transforms cult locations from simple crime scenes into ongoing phenomena that investigation can document but never resolve. The persistence of place as theme explores how locations retain memory or resonance from cult activity in ways that affect subsequent occupants regardless of their knowledge or intentions. Lovecraft repeatedly describes buildings or landscapes that feel wrong, that induce unease in sensitive individuals, that seem to resist normal habitation or development. The witch house causes geometric dreams and psychological disturbance in its tenants. The Innsmouth hotels repel visitors through indefinable atmosphere before any overt cult evidence appears. Various rural properties throughout his fiction remain abandoned not because of economic factors, but because something about them makes prolonged residence impossible. This persistence operates ambiguously. Is it psychological projection by people aware of location history, or genuine supernatural contamination of space? Lovecraft deliberately refuses to clarify, maintaining both possibilities simultaneously. The ambiguity proves more disturbing than certainty would be, since it prevents dismissing the phenomenon as either pure superstition or definitive supernatural fact. Places might genuinely retain something from past cult activity, and if they do, no amount of renovation or redevelopment can eliminate that retention. Liminal geography functions as organizing principle for cult location distribution throughout Lovecraft's work. The positioning of forbidden worship at boundaries, thresholds, and transitional zones where conventional categories break down or intermingle. Coastlines separate land from ocean. Mountains divide valleys from wilderness. Swamps merge earth with water. And certain urban neighborhoods mark borders between respectability and decay. These liminal positions suggest that cult activity arises naturally at locations where normal boundaries weaken, where the membrane separating different modes of existence grows thin or permeable. The philosophical concept derives from anthropology's study of rites of passage, where transitional states, adolescence, betrothal, dying, occupy dangerous positions between established categories and require ritual management. Lovecraft extends this to geography. Locations positioned between established categories become dangerous not through human ritual, but through spatial properties that make them naturally suited for dimensional commerce. The cult does not make the coastline liminal. The liminal coastline attracts the cult. Social invisibility as protective mechanism explains how cult locations persist in modern America despite expanding surveillance, transportation networks, and bureaucratic documentation. Lovecraft recognized that certain populations and places remain effectively invisible to official attention. Rural poverty escapes urban awareness. Immigrant communities operate according to internal dynamics. Majority society never observes, and institutional prejudice ensures that authorities dismiss or ignore reports from marginalized populations. His cult locations exploit these blind spots systematically. Innsmouth survives partly because its economic irrelevance makes it beneath official notice until federal agents have specific reason to investigate. The Louisiana swamp cult operates among populations that police and journalists treat as exotic primitives whose practices merit sensational journalism but not serious intervention. Dunwich's isolation combines with class prejudice. Authorities dismiss hill country residents as degenerate yokels whose bizarre reports can be safely ignored. This social invisibility proves more effective than supernatural concealment for explaining cult persistence. The locations hide in plain sight, protected not by magic, but by the structured inattention that allows mainstream America to ignore uncomfortable populations and places. Urban concealment operates according to different principles than rural isolation, offering cult locations, protection through anonymity, population density, and the assumption that cities represent rationality and progress rather than sites of cosmic horror. Lovecraft's urban cult locations, the Witch House in Arkham, the Federal Hill cult in Providence, various New York sites, demonstrate how cities enable forbidden practices through the same mechanisms that enable other marginal activities. The sheer population density means individual actions escape notice. Boarding houses and tenement buildings provide anonymous spaces requiring no social integration, and urban diversity normalizes religious practices that would seem bizarre in homogeneous communities. The philosophical implication suggests that modernity and urbanization do not eliminate cult potential, but rather transform its operational mode. Rural cults depend on physical isolation. Urban cults depend on social atomization. Both forms achieve the secrecy necessary for cosmic horror worship, but through opposite mechanisms, one through absence of observers, the other through presence of too many observers for any individual to attract sustained attention. The return as cyclical pattern structures, cult location narratives around the concept that cosmic horror operates according to rhythms independent of human history, that cult activity goes dormant during unfavorable periods, then resurges when cosmic conditions align properly. This cyclicality eliminates the possibility of permanent victory. Investigators might disrupt current cult operations, but the underlying cosmic cycles that enable those operations continue regardless. Cthulhu's cults awaken when astronomical configurations approach correct alignment, conduct ceremonies during the brief window of possibility, then fade back into dormancy when the window closes. The implication is that cult locations remain perpetually potential even when no active worship occurs, that the places themselves wait for cosmic timing to make them operationally significant again. This framework transforms cult suppression from permanent solution to temporary management, suggesting that the best investigators can achieve is delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it. The return is built into cosmic horror's structure, not because cults are indestructible, but because the cosmic forces they serve operate on timescales where human intervention achieves nothing more than brief interruption. These philosophical concepts, geographic determinism, temporal layering, persistence of place, liminal geography, social invisibility, urban concealment, and cyclical return, combine to construct cult locations as sites where cosmic horror intersects with human geography in ways that resist permanent resolution. The places themselves become characters or agents within narratives rather than mere settings, possessing properties that shape events and resist human intervention. Cthulhu cults demonstrate the most geographically distributed network in Lovecraft's mythology, appearing wherever human populations maintain contact with deep ocean, Pacific islands, Atlantic coastlines, Gulf ports, and any location where maritime culture intersects with sufficient isolation to permit forbidden practices. The entity's imprisonment in Rulia, beneath the Pacific, creates geographic logic for cult distribution. Communities dependent on ocean resources become vulnerable to deep one contact, dreams transmitted through water, and artifacts dredged from abyssal depths. The Call of Cthulhu documents cult cells operating simultaneously in Louisiana bayous, Norwegian fjords, Pacific atolls, and various port cities, suggesting coordinated worship across continents despite apparent lack of communication technology. The coordination implies either psychic connection through Cthulhu's dreaming influence, or that the entity's nature makes its worship inevitable wherever humans encounter certain oceanic conditions. Coastal cult locations in Lovecraft's work typically share characteristics: economic dependence on fishing or maritime trade, population decline, isolating them from mainstream culture, architecture reflecting nautical traditions, and proximity to deep water permitting submarine access. The geographic pattern suggests that Cthulhu worship is not ideological choice, but environmental response. Coastal populations naturally develop religious frameworks, accommodating the vast alien presence they sense beneath waves. Shub-Niggurath worship concentrates in rural and forested locations, where fertility, agricultural cycles, and generational continuity remain culturally central rather than abstract concepts. The entity characterized as Black Goat of the Woods, with 1,000 young, embodies fecundity at cosmic scale, reproduction beyond control, life proliferating into monstrosity, the agricultural blessing become curse through excessive abundance. Lovecraft situates Shub-Niggurath cults in hill country farms, remote forest clearings, and agricultural communities where inhabitants maintain intimate relationship with breeding cycles, crop yields, and the thin line between plenty and famine. The Dunnage horror involves Whately family worship, invoking Yog-Sothoth, but the broader community participates in May Eve rituals on Sentinel hilltops that gesture towards Shub-Niggurath's fertility aspect. These rural cult locations typically occupy marginal agricultural land, rocky hillsides, exhausted soil, forests encroaching on failing farms, where inhabitants might plausibly turn to cosmic entities for agricultural success normal methods cannot provide. The geographic association reflects ancient fertility cult patterns where agricultural communities worship forces governing reproduction, but Lovecraft transforms benevolent agricultural deities into cosmic horror whose gifts come with catastrophic costs. The 1,000 young are not blessing, but infestation. Nyarlathotep manifestations concentrate in urban centers, universities, and locations where knowledge, culture, and intellectual exchange create opportunities for the crawling chaos to spread his particular form of corruption. Unlike entities imprisoned in specific locations, Nyarlathotep moves freely, appearing wherever humans gather to pursue forbidden knowledge or achieve cultural sophistication that makes them vulnerable to his manipulations. Lovecraft's descriptions place Nyarlathotep in Egyptian settings, Providence's Federal Hill, dreamland cities, and various metropolitan locations where the entity can work through human agents and institutions. The geographic pattern suggests that Nyarlathotep requires human civilization rather than wilderness. He feeds on ambition, curiosity, and the accumulated knowledge that cities concentrate. His cult locations are typically not isolated compounds, but rather addresses in functioning cities. The church on Federal Hill in Providence, where the Starry Wisdom sect operated, university buildings where researchers pursue dangerous studies, museums housing artifacts that should remain buried. These urban cult sites achieve secrecy through blending into urban fabric rather than geographic isolation. A cult meeting in Manhattan apartment or Arkham boarding house attracts no attention because cities normalize religious diversity and private gatherings. The geographic logic inverts rural cult patterns, where Cthulhu and Shub-Niggurath Worship requires isolation from civilization. Nyarlathotep, worship requires proximity to civilization's highest achievements. Yog Sothoth, devotion, centers on locations described as gates or dimensional thin spots, places where the entity coterminous with all space and time can more easily manifest, or where its influence penetrates most directly into human reality. These gate locations lack obvious geographic commonalities beyond the insistence that certain coordinates enable dimensional commerce more readily than others. The Whately farmhouse sits at such a location, its hilltop position and specific geometry making it suitable for the rituals that produce Wilbur and his twin. Lovecraft suggests that these dimensional weak points might be identified through astronomical observation, geological survey, or mathematical analysis of space itself, but he never provides clear methodology. The ambiguity serves narrative function. If anyone could reliably locate gates, they would either be secured by authorities or exploited by numerous cults, whereas Lovecraft's fiction requires that gate locations remain rare, poorly understood, and discovered primarily through inherited cult knowledge or chance encounter. The geographic distribution of Yog Sothoth cult sites appears almost random from human perspective, reflecting that dimensional properties making locations significant operate according to principles human geography cannot easily map. Deep One hybrid communities require very specific geographic conditions, protected harbors enabling fishing economy, sufficient isolation to prevent interbreeding detection, and proximity to offshore deeps where Deep One cities exist. Innsmouth represents the fully developed example, but Lovecraft hints at similar communities along New England coast and presumably in other global locations where these conditions align. The geographic requirements create vulnerability. Deep One communities cannot move freely, but remain tied to specific coastlines where their ocean-dwelling relatives can access them. This geographic constraint enabled the federal raid on Innsmouth and the submarine demolition of offshore reef structures. Yet, the same geographic determinism that makes these communities vulnerable also makes them inevitable. Wherever the necessary conditions exist, Deep One contact becomes possible, and human populations sufficiently desperate for economic survival might accept the terrible bargain Captain Obed Marsh negotiated. The cult locations are not chosen for religious reasons, but emerge from practical commerce between terrestrial and aquatic species, with worship developing afterward to rationalize and sanctify relationships that began as straightforward trade. Dreamland's access points represent Lovecraft's most metaphysically ambiguous cult locations, existing simultaneously as physical places where certain rituals or states of consciousness enable dimensional transition, and as purely mental constructs with no material correlate. The stories involving Randolph Carter suggest that certain New England locations, particular houses, hilltop groves, ancient standing stones, serve as thresholds between waking world and dream dimensions, but the mechanism remains deliberately unclear. Are these physical locations where spatial properties differ, or are they psychologically significant places where individual consciousness can achieve the altered state permitting Dreamland's access? The ambiguity parallels broader questions about whether Lovecraft's cosmic horror is meant to be understood as material, entities existing in physical dimensions, or psychological, projections of human consciousness encountering its own limits. Dreamland's cult locations occupy this uncertainty, Functioning as both concrete geographic sites investigators can visit and as internal psychological states that happen to be triggered or facilitated by certain external locations. The blurring of geographic and mental space suggests that at least some cult locations might not be places at all in conventional sense, but rather psychological states or modes of consciousness that spatial metaphors help describe. Lesser entities and local cults throughout Lovecraft's work. The Martins family's association with subterranean creatures in the Catskills, various unnamed entities worshipped in remote locations by isolated communities, suggest that cosmic horror is not limited to the famous Old Ones, but rather permeates reality at multiple scales. These local cult sites typically involve single families or small communities worshipping entities with limited geographic range rather than cosmic significance. The pattern implies that what makes locations suitable for major cult activity, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, might also make it suitable for minor cult activity, that places where dimensional boundaries weaken admit both vast cosmic forces and smaller intrusions. Alternatively, the proliferation of local cults might suggest that cosmic horror is ubiquitous rather than concentrated, that every sufficiently isolated or liminal location potentially harbors some form of forbidden worship. This latter interpretation proves more disturbing. It transforms cult locations from rare exceptions into potential norm, suggesting that conventional geography sits atop substrate of cosmic horror that erupts wherever human surveillance and social pressure temporarily relax. The cult hierarchy implied by different location types, summoning sites versus meeting locations versus recruitment centers versus hybrid breeding populations, suggests organizational sophistication beyond simple congregational worship. Major cult operations might require multiple coordinated locations serving different functions, remote sites where dangerous rituals occur, urban locations where new members are recruited, maritime sites where dimensional commerce happens, and isolated compounds where hybrid generations mature beyond public observation. This geographic distribution of cult function makes comprehensive suppression nearly impossible. Destroying one location leaves others operational, and the knowledge enabling cult activity persists in texts and human memory independent of any single site. The psychology of cult membership in Lovecraft's fiction reveals motivations ranging from genuine religious conviction through economic desperation to inherited family obligation, creating complex human dimension that prevents dismissing cultists as simply mad or evil. Captain Obed Marsh's initiation of Deep One worship in Innsmouth begins not with religious fervor, but with maritime trade. He discovers entities willing to provide gold and abundant fish in exchange for initially modest offerings, then progressively more disturbing sacrifices as the relationship deepens. The progression from practical commerce to religious devotion mirrors historical patterns where economic relationships with foreign powers gradually transform into cultural and spiritual exchange. Marsh's crew, and later his town, accept Deep One worship because it works. It provides tangible benefits that conventional Christian prayer and honest labor cannot match. This utilitarian foundation for cult membership proves more disturbing than pure fanaticism would be, since it suggests that cosmic horror worship might genuinely offer advantages justifying its horrific costs. Other Lovecraft protagonists join or consider joining cults through intellectual curiosity. the desire to understand forces beyond conventional science, or through family pressure, where cult membership represents ancestral obligation rather than personal choice. The diversity of motivations prevents simple explanations for why humans worship cosmic entities, suggesting instead that multiple pathways lead to the same terrible destination. Generational transmission of cult knowledge and membership creates sustainability, enabling cult locations to persist across centuries rather than collapsing when founding generation dies. Lovecraft emphasizes bloodline continuity repeatedly. The Marsh family controls Innsmouth across multiple generations. The Whateleys maintain their hilltop farm and cosmic connections through careful breeding. Various Providence families preserve occult knowledge in private libraries, passed from parent to child. This generational structure transforms cult participation from individual choice into inherited identity. Children born into cult families often never encounter alternative worldviews that might enable rejection of ancestral practices. The geographic isolation characterizing many cult locations reinforces this generational transmission by limiting children's exposure to mainstream culture and education. A child growing up in Innsmouth or Dunwich learns from birth that certain practices are normal, certain family obligations are absolute, and certain questions must never be asked. By the time such children develop capacity for independent moral reasoning, their entire cognitive and social framework has been shaped by cult assumptions. The psychological literature on cult indoctrination confirms this pattern. Beliefs and practices introduced during childhood become nearly impossible to evaluate objectively in adulthood, since the evaluation framework itself derives from the childhood indoctrination. The role of charismatic leaders claiming direct contact with cosmic entities provides organizational focus, transforming diffuse cult potential into actual worship communities. Captain Obed Marsh in Innsmouth, Wilbur Whately's grandfather in Dunwich, various unnamed cult leaders throughout Lovecraft's fiction serve as intermediaries supposedly capable of communicating with and directing attention from cosmic forces. These leaders typically demonstrate either genuine, anomalous abilities, producing strange artifacts, receiving accurate prophetic information, manifesting physical transformations, suggesting non-human contact, or sufficiently compelling performances of such abilities to convince followers. The charismatic leader model draws on both historical religious movements, where individual visionaries gather followings, and on contemporary cult scholarship, identifying charismatic authority as common feature of new religious movements. Lovecraft complicates the pattern by suggesting that at least some cult leaders genuinely do achieve contact with cosmic entities, rather than simply fabricating claims for social control. This ambiguity between fraud and genuine cosmic commerce prevents dismissing cult leaders as mere charlatans, opening disturbing possibility that their authority derives from actual rather than performed supernatural access. Economic factors prove crucial for understanding cult persistence in Lovecraft's geographic imagination. Poverty, isolation, and economic dependence create conditions where cosmic horror worship becomes rational choice rather than incomprehensible madness. Innsmouth thrives economically during its Deep One alliance period, then collapses into poverty after the relationship sours and the entities withdraw their support. The town's economic rise and fall demonstrates that cult participation can provide genuine material benefits, making it economically rational if morally catastrophic. Rural cult sites throughout Lovecraft's work occupy marginal agricultural land where conventional farming yields insufficient income for survival. The Whately Farm in exhausted Dunwich Hills, various Vermont and Massachusetts settlements on rocky soil where crops fail and livestock sicken. Desperate poverty makes cosmic horror's promises attractive. Entities offer gold, abundant harvests, power over natural forces, knowledge enabling success where honest labor fails. The economic logic transforms cult membership from religious choice into survival strategy, suggesting that eliminating cults requires not just suppression, but addressing the economic conditions that make cult participation attractive. This economic dimension rarely appears in contemporary cosmic horror adaptations, which prefer to portray cultists as fanatics rather than economic actors making terrible but comprehensible calculations. Social cohesion through shared secrets creates powerful community bonds that conventional society cannot match, explaining why cult members often resist outside intervention even when offered rescue from objectively horrific conditions. Psychological research on secret keeping demonstrates that shared secrets strengthen group identity and loyalty, creating in-group, out-group boundaries that reinforce community cohesion. Lovecraft's cult communities maintain elaborate secrets: the nature of their worship, the identities of hybrid members, the locations of ritual sites, the contents of forbidden texts that simultaneously isolate them from mainstream society and bind them together through common knowledge and complicity. An Innsmouth resident who knows about Deep One interbreeding, who perhaps carries some degree of hybrid ancestry, who participated in or witnessed ceremonies, cannot easily integrate into normal society, even if they wish to escape. Their knowledge and experience mark them as permanently different, and the only community offering acceptance consists of other cult members sharing similar contamination. This dynamic explains why federal raids on Innsmouth or other cult locations often produce few willing defectors. The cultists have nowhere else to go, no other community capable of accepting what they have become. The outsider problem: how communities handle investigators, journalists, or authorities who discover cult activity, generates recurring narrative pattern in Lovecraft's fiction, where initial curiosity leads to increasingly desperate attempts to silence or eliminate witnesses. Communities have multiple options for managing outsiders: direct violence, murder or assault, institutional intervention, having outsiders declared insane or arrested on false charges, social pressure, ostracism and intimidation until outsiders leave voluntarily, or recruitment, converting outsiders into cult members. Lovecraft's stories employ all these approaches at various times, with selection depending on outsiders' social position and resources. Respected academics prove harder to simply murder than transient strangers, but their social standing makes recruitment through intellectual appeal more feasible. The pattern demonstrates cult awareness that external discovery threatens survival, requiring active management of information and investigators. The outsider problem also generates narrative tension, protagonists racing to expose cult activity before cult can neutralize them through violence, institutional manipulation, or reality itself changing in ways that make exposure impossible or irrelevant. Hybrid populations created through human entity interbreeding represent Lovecraft's most disturbing vision of cult community transformation, where membership becomes biological rather than merely ideological, and escape becomes impossible rather than merely difficult. Innsmouth's population shows increasing Innsmouth look across generations. Wide-set eyes, narrow heads, rough skin, eventually complete transformation into aquatic form requiring oceanic existence. The biological dimension of cult transformation eliminates possibility of ideological deprogramming or religious conversion. A hybrid cannot choose to stop being hybrid, cannot decide to reject their ancestry, cannot return to purely human status, regardless of personal preference. This biological determinism reflects Lovecraft's documented anxieties about racial mixing and heredity, but it also creates uniquely horrifying vision of cult participation as irreversible transformation of human nature itself. The hybrid cult member occupies tragic position, born into condition they did not choose, transforming into something they may not wish to become, unable to integrate into either human society that rejects them or cosmic entity society that regards them as convenient tools rather than full persons. The corruption gradient describing how normal communities slowly become cult communities operates through incremental transformations so gradual that no single step seems to cross irreversible threshold. Innsmouth did not transform overnight from ordinary fishing town into Deep One hybrid community. The process took generations, each accepting slightly more disturbing bargain than the previous generation, each sacrifice seeming reasonable or necessary given circumstances, until eventually the accumulated transformations produced something monstrous. This gradual corruption proves more psychologically realistic than sudden conversion, reflecting how actual communities and individuals rationalize progressively worse behavior through series of small compromises. The gradient structure also creates narrative dread. A protagonist cannot identify the point where corruption becomes irreversible. How can they know whether their own investigations have already compromised them beyond recovery? The fear is not sudden transformation, but slow erosion, where each step seems manageable, until retrospective reveals one has walked into complete corruption through increments that individually seemed navigable. These human dynamics, diverse motivations for membership, generational transmission, charismatic leadership, economic necessity, social cohesion through secrecy, outsider management, biological transformation, and gradual corruption transform cult locations from simple geographic sites into complex social ecosystems capable of sustaining forbidden worship across generations despite external pressure and internal horror. The human dimension makes cult persistence comprehensible rather than simply attributing it to supernatural protection or isolated fanaticism. Cult secrecy in Lovecraft's fiction operates as practical necessity rather than mere atmospheric element. Congregations worshipping cosmic entities must remain hidden to avoid official intervention, public hysteria, and the collapse of social structures enabling their continued operation. The vulnerability to mundane suppression appears repeatedly across Lovecraft's work. The federal raid destroys Innsmouth's cult infrastructure despite the Deep One's vast power. Inspector LaGrasse's police action disrupts the Louisiana swamp ceremony, and Dr. Armitage's intervention banishes the Dunwich horror through application of knowledge rather than supernatural aid. This vulnerability to conventional authority establishes that cult locations persist not because they are invulnerable, but because they successfully avoid attention until cosmic timing makes their goals achievable or their exposure inevitable. The secrecy serves multiple functions simultaneously. It prevents interference during long preparation periods, maintains mystique that attracts potential recruits intrigued by hidden knowledge, and protects cult members from prosecution under laws prohibiting murder, kidnapping, and other criminal activities that cosmic worship apparently requires. The mundane legal vulnerability proves as significant as any supernatural danger. Cultists fear prison as much as dimensional horrors, and secrecy protects against both. The investigator archetype that Lovecraft deploys across his fiction, academics, journalists, antiquarians, or curious relatives, represents the primary threat to cult secrecy and the narrative mechanism through which readers learn cult geography. These investigators typically begin with innocent curiosity or professional obligation, gradually accumulating evidence that transforms abstract interest into horrified understanding. The investigative process follows recognizable scholarly or journalistic methodology, collecting documents, interviewing witnesses, visiting relevant locations, cross-referencing sources, constructing coherent narrative from fragmentary evidence. This methodological realism grounds cosmic horror in familiar epistemic practices, suggesting that anyone pursuing knowledge systematically enough will eventually uncover evidence of cult activity. The investigator's social position matters significantly. Lovecraft's protagonists are usually educated middle-class white men whose social standing provides both access to information sources and credibility if they attempt to alert authorities. This class and race specificity reveals Lovecraft's assumptions about who possesses legitimate authority to investigate and document reality, but it also suggests that cult secrecy depends partly on excluding or discrediting potential investigators from marginalized populations whose reports receive less institutional credibility. Patterns of discovery in Lovecraft's work typically involve multiple converging information streams rather than single revelatory moment. Ancient texts mention the cult location. Archaeological finds provide physical evidence. Local rumors hint at continuing activity, and personal investigation confirms ongoing operations. This multi-source verification creates narrative momentum, where each piece of evidence makes subsequent discoveries more credible and more horrifying. The pattern mirrors actual investigative journalism and academic research, where a single anomalous data point might be dismissed as error, but multiple independent sources reporting compatible information demand explanation. The Call of Cthulhu exemplifies this structure. Professor Angel's research combines sculptors' visions, police reports from Louisiana, Norwegian sailors' testimony, and anthropological accounts of Pacific cults, each source inadequate alone, but collectively overwhelming. The investigative pattern also creates dread through the reader's growing awareness that protagonist is assembling dangerous knowledge. We watch them piece together information that we know from genre convention will destroy them, creating dramatic irony where reader horror precedes character comprehension. The discovery process becomes horror in itself, independent of what is discovered. The cost of discovery represents Lovecraft's consistent theme that investigating cult locations exacts prices ranging from psychological trauma through social ostracism to physical transformation or death. Protagonists who uncover cult secrets rarely emerge unscathed. Thurston Inn, The Call of Cthulhu, expects imminent death from cult retaliation or supernatural attention. The Innsmouth narrator transforms into Deep One hybrid, making previous human life impossible. Various investigators across Lovecraft's fiction end institutionalized, murdered, or driven to suicide by what they learned. This consistent pattern of investigative cost creates epistemological horror. Knowledge about cult locations is inherently dangerous, not because cultists invariably succeed in eliminating investigators, but because the knowledge itself damages those who acquire it. The cosmic revelation underlying cult activity, that human existence is cosmically meaningless, that entities vastly beyond human comprehension exist and occasionally notice us, that reality operates according to principles incompatible with human psychology, cannot be safely known. The investigator's social position collapses after discovery. Colleagues dismiss their findings as delusion, authorities ignore their warnings, and the investigators themselves can no longer function in society that operates on comfortable illusions they have lost capacity to maintain. Information control by cult organizations demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how knowledge circulates and can be managed even in modern society with mass media and official documentation. Cults employ multiple strategies, eliminating physical evidence through destroying artifacts and documents, discrediting witnesses by having them institutionalized or dismissed as unreliable, bribing or threatening officials to suppress investigations, and creating false explanations for anomalous events that satisfy surface inquiry while protecting deeper secrets. The Innsmouth raid supposedly targeted bootlegging operations and structurally unsound buildings, providing public explanation that concealed actual Deep One hybrid elimination. These mundane cover stories prove remarkably effective. Most people accept conventional explanations over bizarre truth, and institutional incentives favor explanations requiring no unusual action over those demanding extraordinary investigation. The cult information control exploits cognitive biases toward normalcy, institutional inertia, and the practical reality that most people lack time or motivation to investigate. Strange reports. The secrecy persists not through supernatural concealment, but through natural human tendency toward comfortable ignorance when comfortable ignorance remains available. The role of skepticism as cult protection operates ironically. The scientific worldview and Enlightenment rationality that supposedly eliminated superstitious belief actually protect cosmic horror cults by making their existence seem impossible. Educated authorities dismiss cult reports as folklore, mental illness, or fraud precisely because such reports contradict materialist assumptions about reality's nature. This skeptical protection appears repeatedly in Lovecraft's work. Officials ignore warnings about dunnage until physical evidence forces acknowledgement. Mainstream science dismisses evidence of Antarctic civilization discovered in At the Mountains of Madness, and various protagonists' attempts to alert authorities meet with polite dismissal or psychiatric referral. The irony cuts deep. The same scientific methodology that could potentially combat cosmic horror instead protects it by refusing to acknowledge evidence that contradicts established frameworks. Lovecraft himself was committed atheist and materialist, who nonetheless recognized that philosophical materialism might blind humanity to material realities operating beyond current scientific comprehension. The skeptical protection suggests that cult secrecy depends less on cult competence than on mainstream society's cognitive architecture, refusing to process information incompatible with comfortable worldviews. Modern surveillance challenges facing cult secrecy introduce contemporary anxiety about whether technologies like satellite imaging Electronic communication monitoring, DNA databases, and ubiquitous cameras make traditional cult locations impossible. Lovecraft wrote in era before aerial photography became routine, when isolated communities could genuinely escape documentation for extended periods. Contemporary cult locations could not maintain such isolation. Satellite mapping shows every structure. Electronic surveillance monitors, communications, and social media makes extended absence from digital footprint itself suspicious. Yet this technological surveillance might paradoxically enable new forms of cult secrecy. Encryption protects communication. The sheer volume of data overwhelms analysis capacity, and algorithmic filtering can be gamed to hide evidence in statistical noise. The contemporary question becomes whether cult locations are impossible in surveillance society, or whether they simply adopt different operational security matching current technological environment. The answer may be that physical cult locations, as Lovecraft imagined them, isolated towns maintaining secret practices across generations, have indeed become obsolete, but that functional equivalents emerge through digital coordination of physically dispersed members who never meet in single geographic location. The deliberate revelation pattern appears in stories where cults want to be found, either to recruit promising candidates, to intimidate potential threats, or because cosmic timing makes secrecy unnecessary as entities approach manifestation. Nyarlathotep's cults particularly seem to practice selective revelation, allowing certain individuals to discover cult existence as test of whether they possess qualities making them valuable recruits. The Starry Wisdom Church on Providence's Federal Hill operated semi-openly, its weird reputation simultaneously attracting seekers and repelling normal investigation. This selective revelation creates additional layer of epistemological horror. Discovery might not represent investigative success, but rather cult decision that investigator should learn what they are learning. That revelation serves cult purposes rather than threatening them. The investigator cannot determine whether they have genuinely penetrated secrets or whether they are being shown exactly what the cult wishes them to see. This uncertainty transforms investigation from empowering activity into potential trap, where gathering knowledge might constitute falling into carefully prepared snare rather than achieving understanding that enables resistance. These dimensions of secrecy and discovery, practical necessity for concealment, the investigator as threat and narrative device, patterns of multi-source verification, the catastrophic cost of knowledge, cult information control, skepticism as protection, surveillance challenges, and deliberate revelation establish cult locations as sites where epistemological horror operates as powerfully as physical or cosmic horror. The geographic locations matter less than the knowledge structures surrounding them, the ways that information about these places circulates or fails to circulate through society, and the damage inflicted on those who successfully penetrate cult secrets. Having examined the philosophical concepts, entity associations, human dynamics, and epistemological functions of cult locations, we must now turn to specific textual evidence, analyzing how these theoretical patterns manifest in Lovecraft's actual stories, where geographic specificity meets narrative necessity and produces some of weird fiction's most influential and disturbing depictions of places where humans gather to worship cosmic horror. Lovecraft's 1928 masterwork, The Call of Cthulhu, established the template for global cult networks, coordinated through shared worship of single cosmic entity. mapping cult geography across multiple continents and cultures in ways that would influence all subsequent cosmic horror. The story's three-part structure presents cult locations discovered through independent investigations that gradually reveal their interconnection. Henry Wilcox's psychic disturbances in Providence during March 1925, Inspector LaGrasse's 1907 raid on Louisiana swamp cult, and Norwegian sailor Johansen's encounter with Risen Artlier in the Pacific. Each location occupies distinct geography: New England City, Southern Bayou, oceanic coordinates, yet all respond simultaneously to Cthulhu's stirring, suggesting that cult activity coordinates through psychic resonance rather than mundane communication. The Louisiana site features a sodden morass of twisted trees, impossible terrain, weird animal and insect life, and miasmic vapors. Locating cosmic horror in American landscape, already culturally coded as primitive and threatening, LaGrasse's raid discovers a scene of madness and loathsomeness where cultists perform human sacrifice while chanting phrases that later prove remarkably consistent with Pacific cult terminology, documented by Professor Webb of Princeton. This global consistency of cult practice, despite apparent lack of contact between groups, establishes fundamental pattern. Cult locations arise independently wherever necessary geographic and cultural conditions align. The Shadow over Innsmouth, written in 1931, though not published until 1936, provided Lovecraft's most comprehensive development of a single cult location transformed across generations into something barely recognizable as human community. The story maps Innsmouth with bureaucratic precision, a Massachusetts coastal town accessible via rail from Newburyport and Arkham, featuring specific street names, architectural details, and economic infrastructure. The narrator's initial approach emphasizes geographic isolation. The ancient brick and stone buildings were moldering and dilapidated, and many of them bore the most hideous evidences of some frightful fire that had happened years before, creating atmosphere where normal New England town has decayed into something liminal and threatening. The geographic specificity serves narrative function by making Innsmouth feel discoverable, as if readers might visit and verify the narrator's account. Lovecraft provides enough detail that the town should exist: population figures, founding date, economic history centered on shipbuilding and fishing, prominent families including the Marshes and Gilmans, the Federal Street location of the esoteric Order of Dagon, the offshore Devil Reef visible from certain vantage points, the abandoned factories, all receive specific placement within town geography that can be mentally mapped. The Dunwich Horror from 1929 shifts cult location from coast to interior, demonstrating that cosmic horror geography extends beyond maritime settings into rural agricultural America. Dunwich occupies a lonely and curious country of wild domed hills and deep, narrow ravines in north-central Massachusetts, accessible via branch railway, but effectively isolated by terrain and local suspicion of outsiders. The Whately farmhouse sits on hilltop above the village, its elevation both literal and symbolic, raised above mundane community, closer to cosmic forces, occupying threshold between valley civilization and mountain wilderness. Lovecraft describes the location through accumulation of unsettling details. The place was dark and deserted, and one had an uncomfortable sense of things that had happened there long before, suggesting that location itself retains memory of cult activity predating current generation. The nearby standing stones on Sentinel Hill mark ritual site, where cosmic ceremonies occur during favorable astronomical conditions, creating sacred geography within the broader landscape. The story establishes pattern where cult locations contain multiple functionally distinct sites: the farmhouse for breeding experiments, the hilltop for ceremonies, the village for recruiting or intimidating witnesses. The festival from 1925 presents Kingsport as colonial New England town, harboring underground cult infrastructure, invisible to casual observers, established geographic pattern where ordinary American architecture conceals extraordinary horror beneath foundations. The narrator arrives in Kingsport following family tradition requiring attendance at Yuletide ceremony, discovering that familiar town contains hidden dimension, accessible through specific buildings serving as portals. The story emphasizes temporal layering. It was the Yuletide that men call Christmas, though they know, in their hearts, it is older than Bethlehem and Babylon, older than Memphis and mankind, positioning cult worship as predating an underlying Christian tradition. The underground chambers accessed through colonial-era church reveal vast cavern system with phosphorescence of strange fungi and a black abyss crossed by stone bridge, transforming familiar New England geography into Gothic landscape. Kingsport's cult location operates through concealment rather than isolation. The town functions normally. Tourists visit its picturesque harbor, but beneath this normalcy lies infrastructure of cosmic worship that surfaces only during specific calendar dates. The Dreams in the Witch House from 1933 established Arkham as Lovecraft's primary fictional city and demonstrated how urban cult locations function differently from rural or coastal sites. The story focuses on single building, the Witch House on the corner of Miskatonic Avenue, whose geometric properties enable dimensional access despite being surrounded by functioning modern city. Walter Gilman rents the attic room, seeking affordable student housing near the university, discovering that the building's queerly angled corners and jutting overhangs create spatial anomalies where Euclidean geometry fails. The urban setting creates distinct horror. Gilman cannot escape through geographic isolation, but remains surrounded by oblivious normal city, continuing its routine business while he experiences cosmic nightmare in his rented room. The Witch House demonstrates cult location persistence across centuries. Kezia Mason was tried for witchcraft in 1692, yet her chamber's properties remain active in 1928, suggesting that certain buildings acquire permanent alteration through cult usage. The urban cult location pattern would influence subsequent horror fiction, where ordinary apartments or houses in functioning cities harbor extraordinary dangers. Providence itself features across multiple Lovecraft stories as his hometown becomes site of recurring cult activity. The Federal Hill Church, housing the Starry Wisdom sect, various boarding houses, and private libraries containing forbidden texts, the university, and its occult connections. This use of actual city rather than invented location creates maximum verisimilitude, while also suggesting that anywhere might be cult location, that readers' own cities might harbor similar infrastructure beneath familiar surfaces. The Providence stories establish that cult locations need not be remote or obviously sinister, but can function within normal urban fabric, protected by social conventions about privacy, religious tolerance, and the difficulty of monitoring what occurs behind closed doors in populous cities. The geographic strategy shifts from isolation enabling cult activity to anonymity enabling it. Nobody notices one more strange religious group in city containing dozens of such groups. Nobody investigates what happens in private homes and rented rooms. The cumulative effect of these early appearances created comprehensive cult geography, spanning New England and suggesting global extensions. Readers tracking references across stories could construct mental map showing Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich, Kingsport, and Providence as interconnected network where cult activity in one location relates to activity elsewhere through shared cosmic entities, circulating texts, and occasional communication between cult leaders. This geographic interconnection transformed individual stories from isolated incidents into glimpses of vast hidden infrastructure beneath ordinary America. The mapping project continues among contemporary fans who create detailed cartographies of Lovecraft country, determining relative positions of fictional towns and their relationships to actual Massachusetts geography. The Shadow over Innsmouth presents cult location not as meeting site for scattered believers, but as comprehensive geographic and social transformation, where entire community becomes instrument of cosmic horror worship across multiple generations. The story begins with narrator's innocent curiosity about queer old Innsmouth during economical bus tour of Massachusetts coast, establishing that cult location exists as knowable destination rather than inaccessible mystery. Lovecraft provides specific geographic positioning. Innsmouth lies at the mouth of the Monnoxet River, accessible via alternate route from Newburyport to Arkham, bypassed by main highways, after rail service discontinued. This geographic marginalization proves crucial. Innsmouth persists, partly because modern transportation infrastructure literally routes traffic around it, making the town easy to avoid and therefore easy to forget. The narrator's difficulty finding anyone willing to discuss Innsmouth establishes pattern where community's reputation precedes direct evidence, suggesting that knowledge about cult location circulates as rumor and evasion rather than explicit documentation. When the ticket agent warns against visiting, noting, "It ain't much of a place, and you might not like the strange people there," the warning provides just enough information to pique curiosity while maintaining ambiguity about whether strange signifies genuine danger or simple provincial prejudice. The narrator's daylight exploration of Innsmouth documents progressive revelation of cult geography through accumulated unsettling details, building toward comprehensive horror. Initial observations note economic decay. The vast huddle of sagging gambrel roofs and peaked gables conveyed with offensive clearness the idea of wormy decay. Establishing town as location time has passed by and prosperity has abandoned. The architectural detail proves significant. Gambrel roofs characterize colonial New England construction, marking Innsmouth as authentically historic rather than recently founded. Yet the decay suggests something beyond normal aging. The narrator observes queer narrow heads with flat noses and bulgy staring eyes among residents, introducing biological dimension that transforms simple economic decline into something more disturbing. The famous Innsmouth look receives detailed description. I think their predominant color was a grayish green, though they had white bellies. They were mostly shiny and slippery, but the ridges of their backs were scaly. This is not metaphorical strangeness, but literal physical transformation, positioning cult membership as biological fact rather than ideological choice. The geographic tour becomes catalog of wrongness, the abandoned factories, the disproportionate number of jewelry shops suggesting mysterious gold source, the Masonic Hall falling into disrepair, while the esoteric order of Dagon maintains its waterfront headquarters. Zadok Allen's Drunken Revelation provides comprehensive cult history, transforming observed strangeness into horrifying explanation rooted in specific historical events and geographic conditions. The old man describes Captain Obed Marsh's 1838 voyage to Pacific Islands, where he learned of deep ones and their willingness to trade gold and fish for human sacrifices and eventual interbreeding. Allen establishes that cult began not through religious conviction, but economic necessity. Trade was dying out, everybody was losing money, and Captain Obed, he had 3 ships afloat, found things getting too tight for comfort. The initial compact involved modest sacrifices, but escalated as deep ones demanded more intimate access, eventually requiring human women as breeding partners to produce hybrid offspring. This progression from trade, relationship to biological merger, demonstrates how cult locations transform through incremental compromises where each step seems manageable until accumulated changes produce irreversible corruption. Allen describes the 1846 uprising when some Innsmouth residents tried to resist. They was in bad shape at the end. Betty kinda quieted things down by agreeing to do a couple of strainings, which didn't leave nothing but the monsters. Folk got to wondering why there weren't never nothing growed on certain plots of land till they found them kinda sunk into the ground. The Federal Street esoteric order of Dagon represents formalization of cult worship into institutional religion, complete with hierarchy, regular services, and architectural presence dominating town's waterfront. The building's description emphasizes its alien aesthetic within New England context. A crude, neoclassical, pseudo-Grecian affair built of ponderous granite blocks. It had a huge Doric colonnade and a tower surmounted by a hideous belfry. The architecture signals both pretension toward civilization and fundamental wrongness in execution. The forms are recognizably classical, but somehow warped, suggesting builders who understand architectural vocabulary without truly comprehending its principles. The order serves multiple functions. It provides cover story positioning, deep one worship, as eccentric but legal religion. It organizes cult activities, scheduling ceremonies, and managing interbreeding programs, and it serves as social center where hybrid community gathers separate from remaining fully human population. The building's prominent waterfront location near Devil Reef enables easy access for Deep One participants while marking territory as cult-controlled space within town geography. Devil Reef itself represents the critical geographic feature enabling Innsmouth's cult transformation, an offshore rock formation marking boundary between terrestrial and aquatic domains and concealing underwater access to Deep One cities. Lovecraft describes it as a line of ominous rocks and low islets, whose strange aspect and constant turbulence created a fear in the minds of fishermen. The reef's function as threshold space proves essential. It occupies liminal position between land and ocean, visible from shore yet inaccessible except by boat, marking the point where human geography ends and alien geography begins. The narrator learns that deep ones maintain underwater structures near the reef, that sacrificial victims were cast from those rocks, and that submarine demolition crews attempted to destroy reef infrastructure during the federal raid. The geographic specificity matters. Innsmouth's cult cannot exist without this particular coastal feature enabling deep one access, demonstrating how cult locations depend on precise environmental conditions rather than emerging through human choice alone. The narrator's nighttime escape through back streets and abandoned buildings reveals Innsmouth's complete transformation from human town into hybrid habitat where architecture, population, and social structure have reorganized around cosmic horror rather than human civilization. His pursuit by fish-frog hybrids demonstrates that town functions as single organism where hybrid citizens coordinate to prevent information escape and protect collective secret. The chase sequence through decayed, moss-grown stone wharves and vacant gaping windows presents Innsmouth as Gothic landscape of ruin and predation where normal urban safeguards, police protection, public space, stranger anonymity have collapsed. The narrator's successful escape proves temporary as story's coda reveals his own deep one ancestry beginning to manifest, transforming supposed rescue into horror of recognition that investigator carries cult location within his own transforming biology. The personal transformation validates geographic investigation. Innsmouth was not safely external curiosity, but familial inheritance waiting to claim him. The thematic function of Innsmouth within Lovecraft's broader mythology established template for cult location as site of irreversible community corruption, where economic desperation, geographic isolation, and cosmic entity interest converge to transform American town into something no longer recognizably American or human. The story demonstrates that cult locations persist not through supernatural protection, but through predictable mechanisms. Economic incentives maintain member loyalty. Biological transformation eliminates defection possibility. Geographic position enables ongoing entity contact, and social stigma prevents external intervention until transformation becomes complete. Innsmouth's destruction through federal raid provides apparent resolution, yet Lovecraft emphasizes limits of official intervention. The raid killed or captured surface population, but could not reach deep one cities. Submarine demolition damaged, but did not destroy reef infrastructure, and scattered survivors, like the narrator, carry hybrid genetics ensuring cult's biological continuity. The cult location can be militarily suppressed, but not eliminated, demonstrating cosmic horror's fundamental persistence against human attempts at eradication. The Call of Cthulhu operates through narrative structure that assembles global cult geography from fragmentary sources rather than documenting single location comprehensively, creating framework where cult sites emerge as nodes in worldwide network responding to cosmic cycles independent of human coordination. The story's famous opening declares, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents," establishing that geographic investigation of cult locations constitutes dangerous epistemological project where assembling scattered evidence produces understanding that human psychology cannot safely process. Francis Thurston inherits his uncle's research materials, Professor Angel's notes on bas-relief sculpture, police documents about Louisiana cult raid, newspaper clippings about global unrest during March 1925, Johansson's manuscript describing our Laie encounter, and discovers these apparently unrelated materials describe interconnected cult phenomena. The investigative structure mirrors academic research methodology, where a scholar collects sources, identifies patterns, and constructs synthesis, explaining previously incomprehensible data. Yet this conventional scholarly approach leads not to mastery through understanding, but to psychological dissolution, suggesting that cult location research requires precisely the cognitive activities that enable cosmic horror to destroy human meaning-making capacity. The Providence section introduces cult geography through sculptor Henry Wilcox's psychic disturbance during March 1925, when he begins experiencing vivid dreams of great cyclopean cities, of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, accompanied by bass chanting in unknown language. Lovecraft establishes Providence not as remote backwater, but as functioning modern city containing Brown University and thriving artist community, demonstrating that cult phenomena can manifest in centers of culture and education rather than requiring isolated locations. Wilcox produces clay bas-relief depicting tentacled entity and disturbing architecture, unconsciously channeling imagery from Cthulhu's awakening, transmitted psychically to sensitive individuals worldwide. The Providence location serves primarily as receiving station rather than active core site. Wilcox channels cosmic disturbance, but does not worship Cthulhu or belong to organized congregation. This distinction proves significant. It suggests cult geography includes both active worship locations, where believers gather, and passive reception points, where psychically sensitive individuals experience cosmic phenomena without necessarily understanding their source. The geographic distribution of these sensitive individuals, Wilcox in Providence, various artists and poets globally experiencing simultaneous disturbances, maps network of vulnerability rather than deliberate cult coordination. Inspector LaGrasse's 1907 encounter with Louisiana swamp cult represents active worship location where organized congregation conducts ceremonies aimed at facilitating Cthulhu's return. The police raid discovers a lonely and curious country where strange stone circles crept up from the bare earth in forgotten fields, establishing geography through familiar Gothic tropes of isolation and antiquity. The cult ceremony occurs at stone monoliths, perhaps 10 feet in diameter and 5 feet high, sprawling octopus-like upon a pedestal of stone, in clearing surrounded by great oaks and cypresses almost met overhead, and misty vapor rose above the slimy soil and fungoid trees. The description positions cult location at intersection of multiple liminal boundaries between cultivated fields and wilderness, between solid earth and swamp, between human habitation and inhuman monument. LaGrasse's force interrupts ceremony involving frantically dancing creatures performing human sacrifice while chanting Vinglui Malvnaf Cthulhu Roleh Ugahnagel Ftagen, establishing that cult worship involves specific linguistic formulas alongside physical location. The cult's racial composition receives Lovecraft's characteristic prejudiced attention. A very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. The prisoners all proved to be men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. The Louisiana cult's theology and geographic mythology emerged through Castro's testimony describing Cthulhu imprisoned in underwater city Rolia beneath the waters of the Pacific, waiting for stars to be right, enabling emergence. Castro explains, cult maintains knowledge transmitted for untold ages in an oral tradition of gigantic mountain ranges that tower far into the Antarctic and which the natives avoid in superstitious dread, establishing geographic cosmology spanning Pacific islands to Antarctic continent. The testimony positions cult locations as preservation sites for ancient knowledge about cosmic entities and their terrestrial positions, suggesting that human cult geography mirrors non-human entity geography. Cults arise near entity locations not through human choice, but through proximity, enabling contact and recruitment. Castro describes global distribution. Cultists existed scattered all over the world, but that all were united in the secret worship of the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men and who came to the young world out of the sky. This global network operates without visible communication infrastructure, coordinated through shared text fragments and supposedly through psychic connection during periods when Cthulhu's influence strengthens. Professor Webb's anthropological account adds specific geographic layer, describing mysterious Polynesian cult discovered through academic research into death legends and demon cults. Webb encountered Cthulhu references in New Zealand, documenting ritual phrases matching Louisiana cult chants despite thousands of miles separation and apparent lack of cultural contact. The geographic pattern suggests either ancient common origin, single source cult that spread across Pacific before fragmenting, or independent emergence of similar worship, wherever populations maintain sufficient maritime contact to encounter deep ones or other Cthulhu-associated entities. Webb's research establishes that cult knowledge exists in academic literature for anyone willing to correlate sources, that universities contain fragmented evidence scholars dismiss as anthropological curiosity without recognizing cosmic reality underlying supposedly primitive superstition. The university as cult location takes different form than Louisiana, swamp, or Pacific Island. It functions as archive and analysis site, where scholars unknowingly preserve and study cult materials, while rational methodology prevents them from accepting implications of their own research. Johansson's Pacific encounter with Risen Ruya represents the geographic center and cosmic source that explains all other cult locations, the actual entity residence temporarily surfacing from oceanic imprisonment. The manuscript describes a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of Ruya. The geographic coordinates place Ruya at S latitude 47°9, W longitude 126°43 in Pacific region so remote that emergency required a week before reaching any port, but they did reach it eventually, emphasizing isolation from shipping lanes and normal maritime traffic. The city's non-Euclidean geometry creates geographic horror transcending simple wrongness. The architecture operates according to spatial principles incompatible with human perception, where the geometry of the place was all wrong, and angles produce psychological distress through their fundamental incompatibility with evolved human spatial cognition. Cthulhu's emergence from the temple produces the famous steamboat collision that either wounds, annoys, or simply fails to interest the entity before it returns to slumber. The Ruya encounter establishes that all cult locations ultimately reference this central site, that scattered global cults worship entity imprisoned at specific geographic coordinates, and that cult activity intensifies when astronomical conditions approach alignment, enabling entity emergence. The thematic integration of these three geographic investigations, Providence psychic disturbance, Louisiana cult ceremony, Pacific entity encounter, demonstrates Lovecraft's innovative approach to cult location mythology, where no single site provides complete understanding, but where correlation of multiple scattered locations reveals horrifying pattern. The structure suggests that cult geography functions as distributed network rather than centralized organization, that cosmic horror operates through multiple simultaneous manifestations, coordinated not by human communication, but by entity influence transcending geographic distance. The March 1925 timing proves crucial. All three events occur during period when Cthulhu briefly stirs in Urlay, sending psychic waves that disturb sensitive individuals in Providence, energize active cults in Louisiana, and eventually enable temporary outlive surfacing. The geographic coordination suggests either that Cthulhu possesses awareness enabling simultaneous influence across global cult network, or that entity's very existence creates field effect that manifests wherever conditions permit. Cultists do not coordinate their activities, but rather independently respond to cosmic phenomenon, affecting them simultaneously. The investigative failure embedded in narrative structure proves as significant as the geographic discoveries. Thurston assembles comprehensive understanding of global cult network, documents specific locations and testimonies, recognizes pattern connecting seemingly unrelated phenomena. Yet this scholarly success produces no protective knowledge or effective resistance, only the expectation of his own death from cult retaliation or cosmic attention. The geographic knowledge he acquired cannot be weaponized against cult locations because the cults serve entity that cannot be defeated through knowing where its worship occurs. The story's conclusion suggests that cult geography matters less than investigators believe. Documenting locations provides intellectual satisfaction, but no practical advantage, and the investigator's achievement simply marks them for elimination. August Derleth's posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's mythology included extensive geographic expansion that populated the American Midwest with cult locations matching the New England concentration Lovecraft had established. Derleth's Wisconsin stories, The Thing That Walked on the Wind, The Sandwind Compact, and numerous others introduced Arkham House itself, the fictional Miskatonic Valley region, and various rural Wisconsin communities harboring cults worshipping entities Derleth classified according to his controversial elemental theory. His 1945 story, The Lurker at the Threshold, expanded the Whately family mythology while adding detailed geographic description of fictional Billington's Wood and the Standing Stones at its center, creating comprehensive cult infrastructure in regions Lovecraft had mentioned only briefly. Derleth's geographic additions served commercial function. Arkham House publishing required steady supply of mythos fiction, and expanding cult geography into new regions enabled more stories without exhausting Lovecraft's original locations. The systematization proved controversial among purists who argued Derleth betrayed Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism through imposing moral framework where elder gods opposed old ones, but the geographic expansion itself demonstrated mythology's flexibility. Cult locations could proliferate indefinitely wherever writers needed them, limited only by imagination and genre convention requiring sufficient isolation or liminality. Robert Bloch's contributions to collaborative mythos development included urban cult locations, emphasizing psychological horror over geographic isolation, particularly in stories like The Shambler from the Stars and The Shadow from the Steeple. Block's Milwaukee and Chicago stories demonstrated that cult activity required neither remote New England villages nor exotic foreign locations, but could flourish in industrial Midwest cities where anonymity and urban decay provided different form of concealment. His cult locations typically occupied deteriorating urban neighborhoods, cheap boarding houses, abandoned warehouses, forgotten churches, where poverty and social marginalization created invisibility more effective than geographic remoteness. The urban approach reflected Block's personal experience in Depression-era cities where economic collapse produced urban ruins that rivaled any Gothic castle for atmosphere while remaining contemporary and accessible. Block also developed the concept of cult locations as temporary rather than permanent. His cults met in rented spaces that could be abandoned when investigation threatened, demonstrating adaptability that made them harder to suppress than Lovecraft's multi-generational community-based operations. This mobile cult concept would influence later horror, where threatening organizations operate as networks rather than fixed installations. Clark Ashton Smith's contributions generally avoided direct cult location development in favor of creating alternative dimensions, Hyperborea, Zothique, Averoigne, that functioned as entire mythological geographies rather than specific sites within consensus reality. However, his California stories did introduce Pacific Coast cult locations, matching Lovecraft's Atlantic focus while providing different environmental character. Smith's The Holiness of a Zedarak and other Averoigne cycle stories created French medieval setting where cult activity occupied different historical context than Lovecraft's colonial American focus, demonstrating geographic portability of cult concepts across cultures and eras. Smith's ornate prose style and emphasis on decadence over scientific investigation produced cult locations that felt more traditionally Gothic than Lovecraft's quasi-documentary approach, but his integration with mythos established that cult geography could accommodate diverse authorial voices and stylistic approaches. The collaborative flexibility suggested that Lovecraft had created conceptual framework rather than rigid system. Subsequent writers could adapt cult location concepts to their own geographic regions, historical periods, and narrative styles, while maintaining recognizable connection to original mythology. The post-Lovecraft evolution through writers like Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and Thomas Ligotti expanded cult geography globally while introducing contemporary concerns absent from Lovecraft's 1920s-30s context. Campbell's Seven Valley stories transpose mythos to British geography, creating Goatswood and Brichester as equivalents to Arkham and Innsmouth, while incorporating distinctly British atmosphere, stone circles, medieval churches, mill towns that demonstrated cult concepts translated across Atlantic without losing effectiveness. His urban stories set in Liverpool and London showed cult locations adapting to post-industrial decline, occupying abandoned factories and council estates rather than colonial architecture. Lumley's Titus Crow series introduced globe-spanning cult networks with headquarters in various countries, reflecting Cold War concerns about international conspiracies and creating mythos version of spectre-like organizations with geographic reach exceeding anything Lovecraft imagined. Ligotti's work emphasized that cult locations might be primarily psychological rather than geographic. His stories feature characters unsure whether cult sites they visit exist physically or represent consensus hallucinations, introducing postmodern uncertainty about reality status that complicates straightforward geographic documentation. Contemporary writers, including Caitlin R. Kiernan, Laird Barron, and John Langan, have further evolved cult location concepts to address 21st century concerns while maintaining connection to Lovecraft's original framework. Kiernan's Southern Gothic approach to cosmic horror places cult activity in contemporary Atlanta, Birmingham, and other New South locations where racial history, environmental destruction, and economic inequality create conditions for cosmic horror that feel distinctly American while departing from Lovecraft's New England focus. Her cults occupy warehouses, highway rest stops, and suburban developments, thoroughly modern locations that acquire cosmic significance through what happens within them, rather than through architectural age or geographic remoteness. Barron's stories frequently feature cult activity in corporate settings, research facilities, private estates owned by wealthy eccentrics, academic conferences, suggesting that contemporary cults recruit among educated elite rather than rural poor, reflecting shift in how power operates in late capitalism. Langan's work often examines how suburban expansion encounters cult locations, with housing developments built atop sites that should have remained undisturbed, creating horror from collision between contemporary geography and ancient cult infrastructure. The gaming industry's requirements produced extensive cult location development through role-playing game supplements that mapped Lovecraft's fictional geography with unprecedented detail while adding countless new sites. Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu RPG published sourcebooks including Arkham Unveiled, Escape from Innsmouth, and region-specific books covering everything from 1920s New York to Victorian London to contemporary Seattle. These supplements provided street-level maps, building floor plans, and comprehensive descriptions, transforming suggestive literary locations into navigable game spaces. The commercial necessity of providing content for ongoing campaigns meant continuous production of new cult locations. Every supplement needed multiple sites for investigation. Every adventure required cult meeting places, sacrifice chambers, and hidden temples. This productivity transformed cult geography from literary device into comprehensive fictional infrastructure where any location might harbor cosmic horror given appropriate game master creativity. The gaming approach emphasized practical concerns Lovecraft largely ignored. How do cults fund operations? Where do they store artifacts? What happens to cult property after raids? The answers produced bureaucratic mundane detail that made cults feel more like actual organizations and less like narrative conveniences. The wikification of mythos knowledge through online encyclopedias created comprehensive cult location databases that no single author could produce, representing collaborative world building at scale impossible in Lovecraft's correspondence network era. The Cthulhu Wiki, various fan sites, and Wikipedia entries catalog hundreds of cult locations across decades of fiction, organizing them by entity worshipped, geographic region, historical period, and author. These databases make cult location information instantly accessible, while also revealing contradictions and variations. Innsmouth's population varies between sources. Arkham's precise location shifts. Different authors place Cthulhu's cult network differently. The wikification produces both comprehensive reference and evidence of mythology's constructed nature, simultaneously enabling detailed engagement and revealing arbitrary foundations. Contemporary fans debate cult location canon, attempt to reconcile contradictory accounts, and produce maps synthesizing multiple sources into coherent geography. This taxonomic impulse reflects attempt to master cosmic horror through comprehensive cataloging, transforming Lovecraft's suggestions into exhaustive databases, the very anthropocentric response to unknowable horror that his fiction critiqued. Modern writers increasingly acknowledge that digital technology fundamentally challenges traditional cult location concepts, requiring either period pieces set in pre-internet eras or extensive explanation for how cults maintain secrecy in surveillance society. Some authors avoid the problem through period settings. Others address it directly by showing cults adapting operational security to contemporary environment, using encryption, avoiding electronic traces, or accepting that physical cult locations have indeed become obsolete while cult networks persist through different organizational structures. The question of whether Lovecraftian cults could operate in contemporary America produces diverse fictional answers ranging from no, which is why these stories occur in past, to yes, but through methods Lovecraft never imagined. The geographic imagination shifts from asking, where are the secret cult locations, to how do cults operate without fixed locations in era of pervasive surveillance, transforming question from geographic to operational. These collaborative expansions and adaptations demonstrate both Lovecraft's original framework's remarkable flexibility and its fundamental limitations. Cult locations can proliferate across any geography and era, but they require either isolation or anonymity that contemporary technology makes increasingly difficult to achieve. The evolution from Lovecraft's specific New England focus to global distribution reflects both commercial necessity for fresh content and recognition that cosmic horror concepts can be separated from the original cultural context while retaining effectiveness. The boundary between Lovecraft's fictional cult locations and purported real sites has eroded systematically since the 1970s, when various factors, occult revival, satanic panic, and growing Lovecraft fandom converged to create cultural environment where people began treating invented geography as potentially or actually real. Online forums, paranormal investigation websites, and occult discussion boards contain extensive documentation of supposedly genuine Lovecraft cult activity at specific coordinates. The forums list addresses in Providence, where the Starry Wisdom Church allegedly operated. Coastal Massachusetts towns claim to be the real Innsmouth, and rural New England locations where posters report encountering communities matching Dunwich's description. These claims range from obvious role-playing through genuine confusion about fiction's status to possible delusion or deliberate hoaxing. What proves culturally significant is not whether any claims are accurate, but that the claims proliferate. Enough people want to believe or claim to believe that cult locations exist beyond Lovecraft's fiction, that they invest time constructing evidence and documentation. The desire itself reveals something about contemporary relationship to place, secrecy, and the need to believe that ordinary geography conceals extraordinary reality. The satanic panic of the 1980s and early 1990s produced wave of allegations about secret ritual abuse sites that borrowed heavily from Lovecraftian cult geography, even when accusers had no conscious knowledge of the source material. Therapists using recovered memory techniques elicited accounts of underground chambers, robed congregations, non-human entities, and multi-generational cult families that structurally matched the shadow over Innsmouth. more closely than any documented religious practice. The McMartin preschool case in California, the Kern County ritual abuse cases, and numerous other allegations described secret tunnels, hidden rooms, and cult meeting sites that extensive investigation never substantiated, but that bore remarkable similarity to Lovecraft's fictional infrastructure. The parallel suggests that Lovecraft had tapped into or helped create cultural template for how Americans imagine secret evil operates, not as individual predators, but as organized communities with dedicated geography, inherited membership, and practices hidden beneath respectable surfaces. Whether Lovecraft's fiction influenced these accusations directly, or whether both drew on common cultural anxieties about hidden threats, the structural similarity demonstrates his cult location concepts migration from weird fiction into psychology, law enforcement, and therapeutic practice, with catastrophic consequences for falsely accused individuals. Internet folklore about specific New England locations has generated tourist economy, where Lovecraft enthusiasts visit Providence, Marblehead, and other sites seeking cult evidence or simply experiencing geographic inspiration for favorite stories. The online communities share photographs of colonial architecture matching Lovecraft's descriptions, identify buildings that might have inspired fictional locations, and debate which real towns best correspond to invented Innsmouth or Kingsport. Some visitors approach these pilgrimages as literary tourism, visiting authors' hometown and regional settings to better appreciate work, while others genuinely seek evidence that fiction contains hidden truth. The distinction blurs in online accounts where posters describe finding the real Innsmouth or discovering esoteric order of Dagon evidence, using language ambiguous between metaphor and literal claim. Providence particularly has developed quasi-official Lovecraft tourist infrastructure with walking tours, museum exhibits, and annual conventions that celebrate author while carefully avoiding endorsing belief that his cult locations exist. Yet even official tourism materials exploit the ambiguity. Brochures describe locations that inspired stories without firmly establishing whether inspiration means artistic influence or documentary observation. Geocaching and occult tourism have merged Lovecraftian cult geography with contemporary technology, enabled treasure hunting, producing activities where participants use GPS coordinates to locate sites designated as cult relevant, either through fiction or through participant declaration. Geocaches hide containers at locations they claim match Lovecraft's descriptions or possess appropriate atmospheric qualities, then challenge others to find them using coordinate clues and cryptic descriptions. The activity treats New England landscape as puzzle or game board, where Lovecraft's fictional geography provides template for real-world exploration. Some geocaching challenges explicitly frame their goals as finding cult sites or locating elder sign protections, while others simply use Lovecraftian aesthetics without claiming literal connection. The practice demonstrates how fiction shapes actual geographic engagement. People navigate real landscape using fictional map, visit real locations to experience fictional associations, and document these visits in ways that blur whether they are playing game, conducting literary research, or genuinely investigating cosmic horror possibilities. The ambiguity appears deliberately cultivated rather than accidentally produced, suggesting participants enjoy uncertainty about whether their activity constitutes innocent fandom or dangerous investigation. Claimed encounters with active cult sites proliferate on paranormal forums and creepypasta platforms, with posters describing stumbling upon ceremonies in remote forests, discovering abandoned buildings with cult symbols, or observing communities that match Innsmouth's characteristics. These narratives follow consistent patterns. The poster emphasizes their initial skepticism, describes encountering evidence that gradually overwhelms doubt, and concludes with warnings against visiting the location or investigating further. The narrative structure itself derives from Lovecraft. Skeptical investigator confronts mounting evidence, achieves understanding that destroys comfortable worldview, and warns readers while knowing warnings will be ignored. Some accounts provide specific coordinates or route directions, inviting verification that rarely occurs. Others deliberately withhold location details, claiming they want to protect readers or prevent cult attention. This withholding paradoxically enhances credibility. If the poster provided coordinates and verification attempts found nothing, the hoax would be exposed. But by refusing verification, the story remains unfalsifiable. The accounts function as collaborative fiction or perhaps as genuine belief, with line between these possibilities remaining deliberately unclear. The phenomenon of suburban legends about local cult sites, the abandoned house that neighbors avoid, the forest where strange lights appear, the old church that holds services no one attends, demonstrates how Lovecraftian cult geography has been absorbed into American folklore's standard repertoire. Nearly every region now contains local variation on secret cult meeting place, described using language and concepts that trace genealogically to Lovecraft, even when current narrators have never read his work. The suburban legend typically includes warning against visiting the site, story about investigators who disappeared or went mad, and insistence that authorities know but refuse to intervene. These elements all appear in Lovecraft's stories, suggesting his fictional inventions have become templates that folk narrative automatically applies to genuinely mysterious or simply unfamiliar local locations. The process resembles how European witch trial narratives created templates that later generations applied to new situations. The cultural form persists and proliferates, independent of accuracy or original context. The blurring between fiction and purported reality reaches perhaps its most sophisticated form in online alternate reality games and collaborative fictions, where participants collectively construct evidence of cult activity at real locations, producing photographs, documents, and testimonies that other participants investigate as if genuine. These activities explicitly acknowledge their fictional status while maintaining immersive pretense, creating spaces where people can engage with cult location concepts without either dismissing them as merely fictional or committing to belief in literal cosmic horror. The games suggest the contemporary relationship to cult geography operates in third category, beyond belief and disbelief, a willing suspension where participants know intellectually that cult locations are fictional, yet emotionally and imaginatively engage with them as if real. This third category may represent distinctive contemporary mode of relating to fiction, enabled by internet culture's ironic sincerity and post-truth environment, where factual status becomes less relevant than emotional or aesthetic resonance. These various forms of cult location belief, tourism, folklore, and play demonstrate that Lovecraft's fictional geography has achieved independent cultural existence separate from his texts. People engage with cult location concepts without necessarily reading the stories that invented them, influenced by cultural transmission that has made certain ideas about secret places simply available in collective imagination. Film adaptations of Lovecraft's cult location stories face fundamental challenge. Literary horror depends on suggestion, atmospheric accumulation, and reader imagination filling gaps, while visual media must show specific locations, making concrete what literature left ambiguous. Stuart Gordon's 1986 film, From Beyond, attempted to visualize cult location through single house containing dimensional gateway technology, transforming Lovecraft's cosmic horror into practical effects spectacle, where the building itself becomes character through increasingly grotesque transformations. The film demonstrated both possibilities and limitations of visual cult location. Gordon's production design created memorably disturbing spaces through organic growth consuming architecture, slime-covered walls suggesting dimensional contamination, and lighting that made familiar domestic spaces alien. Yet this visual specificity eliminated the literary version's ambiguity about whether locations possessed genuine supernatural properties or whether narrator perception was unreliable. Seeing the transformation on screen confirms it as objective reality, removing the epistemological uncertainty that characterizes Lovecraft's prose. The film succeeds as body horror and fails as cosmic horror, demonstrating that visual media's strengths, spectacular imagery, visceral impact, work against cosmic horror's fundamental ambiguity about reality's nature and perception's reliability. The 2001 Spanish film Dagon, directed by Stuart Gordon, adapting The Shadow over Innsmouth, provided cinema's most comprehensive attempt to realize Lovecraft's cult location concepts through extended depiction of isolated coastal town harboring hybrid population and active Deep One worship. The production filmed in Galician fishing villages that provided authentic, decrepit maritime atmosphere Lovecraft described, using practical locations that needed minimal modification to convey decay, isolation, and wrongness. Gordon's decision to relocate the story from Massachusetts to Spain enabled shooting in genuinely remote locations while avoiding comparison to actual New England geography that might break immersion. The film visualized the esoteric order of Dagon Temple, hybrid population's physical transformation, and the climactic ceremony where protagonist discovers his ancestry, making explicit what Lovecraft conveyed through inference and partial description. The visual cult geography succeeded in capturing atmosphere, the labyrinthine streets, claustrophobic architecture, an omnipresent ocean creating genuine unease, while struggling with how to depict deep ones and hybrids in ways that maintained menace rather than seeming ridiculous. The practical effects and creature design proved uneven, demonstrating persistent problem in Lovecraft adaptation. Entities that terrify through description often disappoint when made visible. Video game adaptations of cult location concepts have proven more successful than film at maintaining ambiguity while providing navigable spaces, since games can use mechanical limitations, controlled perspectives, and player uncertainty to preserve atmospheric dread. Frogware's Call of Cthulhu, 2018, created explorable, dark water island cult community that players investigate through first-person perspective, combining environmental storytelling, NPC interactions, and sanity mechanics that make player question their perception reliability. The game's cult compound featured underground chambers, ceremonial spaces, and architectural details suggesting multi-generational occupation, creating geographic specificity while using darkness, limited visibility, and perspective tricks to maintain uncertainty about what spaces actually contain. The sanity mechanic proves crucial for preserving ambiguity. As protagonist's mental state deteriorates, the environment changes in ways players cannot determine are objective transformation or subjective hallucination. This mechanical implementation of unreliable perception enables games to achieve something film struggles with, showing cult locations while maintaining doubt about whether shown spaces represent actual geography or protagonists' deteriorating mental interpretation. Tabletop role-playing games have generated most extensive cult location development through necessity of providing game masters with detailed sites for investigation scenarios, producing source books that map fictional geography with cartographic precision. Chaosium's Escape from Innsmouth supplement provides street-level maps of the town, floor plans for key buildings including the esoteric Order of Dagon headquarters and the Marsh refinery, and detailed descriptions of businesses, residents, and secret locations. The supplement transforms Lovecraft's atmospheric description into usable game infrastructure, complete with population statistics, economic data, and specific room dimensions. This encyclopedic approach serves gaming's practical requirements while fundamentally transforming cult locations from literary suggestions into concrete data. The gaming approach reveals underlying tension. Players want detailed information, enabling informed decisions, but excessive detail eliminates the mystery that makes locations horrifying. Successful gaming supplements balance comprehensiveness with ambiguity, providing enough specificity for navigation while preserving uncertainty about locations' deeper nature and cult activity's full extent. Arkham horror board games and their digital adaptations created abstracted cult location system where specific sites become board positions with mechanical effects, transforming Lovecraft's geographic specificity into gameplay tokens while maintaining thematic resonance. The board game's Arkham map features recognizable locations: Miskatonic University, the Witch House, Independence Square, as spaces players move between while investigating cosmic threats. Each location provides different mechanical advantages and risks. Universities grant research bonuses. Occult shops sell useful items, but cult-controlled sites might spawn monsters or advance doom track. This abstraction reduces cult geography to its functional essence. Locations are resources and threats within game system, stripped of atmospheric detail, but preserving narrative role as sites where human and cosmic forces interact. The mechanical implementation demonstrates how cult location concepts can be formalized into rules while losing much of what makes them literarily effective. The board game location serves strategic function, but cannot replicate the dread produced by reading detailed description of Innsmouth's decay. Musical engagement with cult location themes has produced varied approaches, from ambient soundscapes attempting to evoke specific sites to metal bands writing narrative albums about cult communities. Cryo Chamber's dark ambient label has released multiple albums explicitly inspired by Lovecraft's geography, with titles like Manta Sound from the Trenches of Rulia, and compositions creating sonic environments meant to evoke specific cult locations through drone, field recordings, and processed sound. These ambient works attempt to translate literary atmosphere into pure audio, using low frequencies to suggest vast underwater spaces, industrial sounds for decaying New England towns, and treated vocals for cult ceremonies. The music functions as soundtrack for reading or role-playing rather than standalone experience, enhancing engagement with cult location concepts through adding sensory dimension literature cannot provide. Death metal and black metal bands have taken more direct narrative approaches, with groups like Sulphur Ion writing song cycles about specific Lovecraft locations, including detailed lyrics describing cult activity, architecture, and geographic features. The metal approach combines atmosphere with storytelling, using crushing heaviness to convey cosmic dread, while lyrics provide specific geographic detail. The podcast medium has enabled new form of cult location storytelling through audio drama productions that combine sound design, voice acting, and narrative structure to create immersive experiences of investigating fictional sites. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society produced audio adaptations of major stories with extensive environmental sound, creating geographic specificity, waves crashing on Innsmouth shore, footsteps through abandoned streets, doors opening into cold chambers that grounds cosmic horror in tangible sensory experience. Podcasts like the Magnus Archives have adapted Lovecraftian cult location concepts into original narratives using archive format, where each episode documents different site, gradually revealing connections between scattered locations and building toward cosmic revelation. The serial format enables slow accumulation of geographic detail across episodes, mimicking how Lovecraft built his mythology across multiple stories while allowing for extensive development impossible in single narrative. Virtual reality represents most recent frontier for cult location adaptation, offering possibility of truly immersive navigation of fictional spaces, but facing technical and design challenges in creating environments that maintain horror rather than becoming curiosities. VR implementations of Lovecraft locations struggle with motion sickness, concerns that limit environmental complexity, computational constraints that reduce visual detail, and the fundamental problem that player agency, ability to look anywhere, approach anything, can dispel carefully constructed atmosphere by revealing limitations of design. Successful VR horror typically uses controlled perspectives, forced paths, and strategic obscurity rather than open exploration, but these techniques contradict VR's supposed advantage of freedom and presence. The medium's evolution suggests that effective cult location VR will require accepting medium-specific constraints rather than attempting direct translation of literary or film approaches. These adaptations across media demonstrate cult location concepts' remarkable portability, while revealing that effectiveness depends on medium-appropriate implementations. What works in literature may fail in film. Game adaptations require mechanical formalization, and each medium must negotiate differently between specificity and ambiguity. The persistent adaptation attempts reflect both commercial value of Lovecraft's brand and genuine creative challenge. How to maintain cosmic horror's essential uncertainty while providing concrete experiences audiences can navigate, visualize, or interact with. The migration of cult location concepts into media has paralleled their appropriation by academic scholars, subcultural practitioners, and others who engage with Lovecraft's geography as serious object of study rather than simply entertainment content. Academic geography and spatial theory have increasingly treated Lovecraft's cult locations as serious subjects for scholarly analysis, examining how fictional spaces reflect and shape cultural anxieties about place, identity, and belonging in early 20th century America. Geographers like Dennis Cosgrove and cultural theorists, including Rob Latham, have published essays analyzing Lovecraft's New England as constructed geography, encoding anxieties about immigration, urbanization, and modernity's disruption of traditional spatial orders. These scholars examine how Innsmouth's decay and isolation represent broader American concerns about communities left behind by economic progress, how Arkham's university town status reflects tensions between cosmopolitan knowledge and local tradition, and how cult locations generally function as heterotopias, Foucault's term for spaces that exist within society while operating according to different rules than surrounding geography. The academic analysis treats cult locations as cultural texts revealing historical anxieties rather than simply narrative devices, positioning Lovecraft as inadvertent documentarian of American spatial imagination during a period of massive demographic and economic transformation. The scholarly attention validates cult geography as worthy of serious intellectual engagement, while potentially draining it of horror through analytical domestication. Once fully explained through theory, can the location still disturb? The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society represents unique institutional appropriation of cult geography, creating physical spaces celebrating and studying Lovecraft's locations through museum exhibits, walking tours, and annual conventions, transforming Providence into pilgrimage site for fans. The organization conducts official and unofficial tours of Providence neighborhoods where Lovecraft lived, identifying buildings he frequented and locations he described in stories, creating infrastructure that makes fictional cult geography tangible through association with autobiography. The annual Necronomicon convention transforms Providence hotels and venues into temporary cult locations through programming, decor, and participant performances that blur boundaries between scholarship, fandom, and immersive experience. Attendees discuss academic papers analyzing cult geography while attending parties themed around Innsmouth or participating in theatrical events simulating cult ceremonies. This institutional appropriation demonstrates professionalization of Lovecraft fandom, where informal interest groups have evolved into organizations with budgets, programming committees, and official status negotiating with city authorities about event permits. The transformation from underground fandom to sanctioned cultural activity represents mainstreaming that makes cult geography safe for public consumption. What was transgressive becomes tourism. What was forbidden becomes heritage. Occult practitioners have adopted Lovecraft's cult locations as templates for actual ritual practice, with magicians particularly in chaos magic tradition conducting ceremonies at sites the author described or using fictional geography as framework for pathworking and visualization exercises. Chaos magicians argue that Lovecraft created functional egregores, thought forms given substance through collective belief, and that cult locations possess genuine magical properties derived from decades of readers' attention and imagination rather than any inherent cosmic significance. Practitioners report conducting rituals at Providence locations Lovecraft described, visiting New England coastal towns seeking Innsmouth energy, and using fictional cult geography as mental landscape for magical working. The occult appropriation treats Lovecraft's invented mythology as equivalent to historically transmitted magical traditions, arguing that cultural impact and psychological resonance matter more than historical authenticity for magical effectiveness. This position proves philosophically interesting. If magic functions through psychology and belief rather than objective supernatural forces, then recently invented mythology might work as well as ancient tradition, given sufficient practitioner commitment and cultural resonance. The practice generates discomfort among both Lovecraft scholars who resist their subject being treated as actual occultism and traditional occultists who dismiss Lovecraftian work as juvenile appropriation lacking proper lineage. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators have incorporated Lovecraftian cult location concepts into their investigative frameworks, treating fictional sites as potentially real and approaching actual locations with equipment and methodology supposedly capable of detecting cosmic horror manifestations. Television programs and YouTube channels feature investigators visiting Providence, exploring abandoned New England buildings, and searching coastal areas for Innsmouth-like communities using thermal cameras, EMF detectors, and recording equipment while explicitly referencing Lovecraft's descriptions. The investigations typically find ambiguous results, unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctions, investigators reporting uncomfortable feelings that neither confirm nor refute cult presence, but maintain profitable ambiguity, permitting continued programming. This paranormal appropriation demonstrates how Lovecraft's cult geography has been absorbed into broader supernatural investigation culture as standard category alongside haunted houses and UFO sites. The treatment suggests cultural shift where fictional and allegedly real paranormal phenomena occupy continuous spectrum rather than discrete categories, reflecting post-truth environment where evidentiary standards have relaxed and narrative engagement supersedes factual verification. Urban exploration communities have adopted Lovecraftian aesthetics and cult location language when documenting abandoned buildings, treating decay and architectural strangeness as evidence of cosmic horror influence even when consciously engaging with metaphor rather than literal belief. Urban exploration forums and social media accounts describe Innsmouth-like architecture in post-industrial towns, photograph cult symbols in abandoned churches or factories, and frame their documentation using Lovecraft-derived language about forbidden spaces and dangerous knowledge. This appropriation demonstrates how cult location concepts have become general-purpose vocabulary for describing certain experiences of place, particularly the encounter with abandoned human infrastructure being reclaimed by natural forces or occupied by unofficial populations. The urban explorers typically acknowledge their use of Lovecraft as aesthetic framing rather than factual claim, yet the aesthetic choice shapes how they perceive and document spaces, demonstrating fiction's power to provide interpretive frameworks that structure experience even when recognized as fictional. The abandoned factory becomes cult temple, graffiti becomes ritual symbols, and trespassing becomes investigation, transforming criminal activity into narrative adventure through Lovecraftian lens. The SCP Foundation Collaborative Writing Project has created most extensive bureaucratic appropriation of cult location concepts, transforming cosmic horror geography into subjects of institutional containment protocols and scientific documentation. The Foundation's wiki contains hundreds of entries describing anomalous locations, requiring ongoing monitoring or active containment, many explicitly Lovecraftian in inspiration, though filed within the Foundation's clinical documentation style. Entries describe small towns exhibiting collective, anomalous behavior, buildings whose interior geometry violates spatial laws, and geographic regions where reality operates according to non-standard principles. The documentation typically includes discovery circumstances, containment procedures, interview logs with survivors or inhabitants, and incident reports describing containment breaches. This bureaucratic framework transforms cult locations from sources of cosmic dread into management problems, anomalies requiring resources, personnel, and procedures, but ultimately subject to institutional control. The SCP approach demonstrates distinctive contemporary cultural move, acknowledging cosmic horror while simultaneously asserting human capacity for institutional response, maintaining dread while insisting that sufficiently organized bureaucracy can at minimum contain, if not eliminate, threats. The framework proves immensely popular, suggesting audiences appreciate horror that acknowledges human agency, even when that agency achieves only temporary management rather than permanent victory. Academic conferences on Lovecraft and cosmic horror have transformed scholarly discussion of cult locations into institutional practice with formal programming, peer review, and publication pipelines, representing full academic legitimation of topics once considered lowbrow genre fiction. The Necronomicon Providence academic track, the Lovecraft Annual Journal, and various university-hosted symposia feature papers analyzing cult geography through lenses including critical geography, post-colonial theory, disability studies, and environmental humanities. Scholars examine how Lovecraft's cult locations encode ableist assumptions about degeneration, how they reflect colonial anxieties about indigenous populations and racial mixing, how they anticipate contemporary concerns about climate change and environmental collapse, and how they participate in American Gothic tradition's interrogation of national mythology. This academic legitimation transforms cult locations from entertaining fiction into complex cultural texts warranting sophisticated theoretical analysis, positioning Lovecraft alongside canonical authors despite his problematic politics and pulp origins. The academic appropriation demonstrates how cultural materials migrate from popular culture to institutional scholarship, gaining prestige and analytical attention while potentially losing immediate emotional impact. The cult location, carefully analyzed through theoretical framework, becomes object of knowledge rather than source of dread. These varied subcultural and academic appropriations, geographic scholarship, institutional fandom, occult practice, paranormal investigation, urban exploration, bureaucratic fiction, and academic conference culture demonstrate cult location concepts, migration, beyond original literary context into diverse cultural practices and interpretive frameworks. The appropriations reveal both concepts' flexibility and their fundamental ambiguity. Cult locations can be analyzed, visited, ritually engaged, investigated, documented, and theorized without any practice definitively establishing whether they function as pure fiction, psychological constructs, aesthetic frameworks, or something genuinely anomalous. Having examined how various communities and institutions have appropriated cult location concepts, we must now consider the ultimate question: why do these fictional places persist so powerfully in contemporary cultural imagination? What human needs or anxieties do they address? And what might their enduring appeal reveal about our relationship to place, secrecy, and the suspicion that ordinary geography conceals extraordinary horrors? The persistent cultural fascination with Lovecraftian cult locations reveals fundamental human need to believe that ordinary geography conceals extraordinary reality, that beneath visible surface of mundane towns, neighborhoods, and landscapes lie hidden communities, secret practices, and cosmic connections that transform how we understand space and belonging. This psychological need operates independent of whether such cult locations actually exist, functioning instead as projection of desire for a world more complex and significant than empirical observation suggests. The alternative, that geography is exactly what it appears to be, that isolated towns are simply economically declining, that strange architecture reflects only historical building practices, that odd behavior has prosaic explanations, proves emotionally unsatisfying in ways that drive persistent search for hidden meaning. Lovecraft's cult locations provide narrative framework for this search, offering template that feels simultaneously exotic enough to be interesting and familiar enough to be applicable to actual places encountered in ordinary life. The framework persists because it addresses psychological need that facts cannot satisfy, the need for reality to contain more than surface appearances reveal, for existence to involve mysteries accessible to those willing to investigate beyond comfortable assumptions. Geographic anxiety about communities that might harbor cults reflects broader contemporary concerns about surveillance limits, institutional oversight failures, and the possibility that even in highly documented modern societies, certain populations and places escape official knowledge and control. The question of whether isolated communities could maintain practices radically incompatible with mainstream values without detection becomes particularly urgent in context of actual cult disasters, Jonestown, Waco, NXIVM, that demonstrated how groups can indeed operate for extended periods while conducting horrific practices before official intervention occurs. Lovecraft's fictional cult locations tap into justified anxiety that official surveillance remains imperfect, that geographic isolation or urban anonymity can conceal abuse, and that communities might collectively maintain secrets even when individual members suffer. This anxiety has intensified rather than diminished with surveillance technology's expansion, the revelation that even comprehensive monitoring misses important phenomena creates paradoxical sense that if such extensive surveillance fails to detect everything, perhaps it detects less than we believe. The cult location persists as cultural concern because it represents plausible possibility. Somewhere, perhaps, communities operate according to principles that would horrify mainstream society if discovered, protected not by supernatural concealment, but by systemic limitations of institutional oversight. The rural versus urban cult location dichotomy reflects different forms of contemporary social fear. Rural isolation enabling multi-generational practices preserved through geographic remoteness versus urban anonymity, enabling practices hidden through population density and social atomization. Rural cult locations tap into urban American anxiety about interior regions supposedly left behind by progress, where economic decline, population loss, and cultural isolation create conditions for radicalization, extremism, or simple difference that urban populations find threatening. The flyover country rhetoric, political polarization between urban and rural America, and cultural stereotypes about rural backwardness all feed into plausibility of rural cult locations operating beyond civilized oversight. Urban cult locations address opposite anxiety, that cities contain too many people, too much diversity, too many subcultures for any monitoring to be comprehensive, that urban anonymity permits anything to occur behind closed doors without neighbors knowing or caring. The urban cult can hide in plain sight, protected by everyone minding their own business in ways that rural communities supposedly cannot achieve due to smaller populations and greater social interconnection. Both forms of cult location address fundamental anxiety about modern geography's failure to achieve promised transparency. Neither rural isolation nor urban development has eliminated spaces where forbidden practices might persist. Community paranoia about neighbors potentially being cult members reflects erosion of social trust and increasing awareness that surface presentations reliably indicate neither belief nor behavior. The Innsmouth model, where entire community participates in cult activity while maintaining facade of normalcy, particularly resonates in contemporary moment characterized by political polarization, conspiracy theories, and suspicion that fellow citizens might hold beliefs or engage in practices incompatible with shared society. The question of how well we actually know neighbors, co-workers, or even family members becomes increasingly salient in digital age, where online activity, encrypted communications, and social fragmentation mean that people occupy multiple discrete social worlds that never fully intersect. The cult location anxiety reflects recognition that geographic proximity no longer guarantees social transparency, that living next door to someone provides minimal insight into their actual beliefs or practices. This paranoia proves both justified. Numerous revelations of hidden abuse, secret extremism, or double lives confirm that surface presentations can be comprehensively misleading and destructive, corroding social trust necessary for functioning communities. Lovecraft's cult locations provide narrative framework for this paranoia, while also suggesting its limits. The communities that are comprehensively corrupt typically exhibit warning signs that observant outsiders can detect, suggesting that genuine attention and social connection might still enable identification of dangerous situations. The question of whether digital spaces constitute new form of cult location represents pressing contemporary concern about online communities that develop beliefs, practices, and social structures incompatible with offline society. The internet enables congregation without geographic proximity, allowing scattered individuals to form communities with cult-like dynamics, charismatic leaders, secret knowledge, escalating commitment, isolation from outsiders, while never physically meeting. Online radicalization pipelines, QAnon, incel forums, and various extremist communities demonstrate that digital cult locations can produce real-world consequences despite existing purely as information networks rather than physical sites. This represents fundamental challenge to Lovecraft's geography-based cult model. If cult locations no longer require geographic coordinates, but can exist as URLs or encrypted channels, does the concept retain meaning, or must it be fundamentally reconceived? The contemporary answer seems to be that digital cults are indeed new phenomenon requiring different analytical frameworks, but that Lovecraftian cult location concepts remain relevant as metaphors or templates even when literal geography has been replaced by information topology. The internet forum becomes hidden valley. The private Discord server becomes coastal town no one visits. And the journey from mainstream platforms into extremist spaces replicates the narrative journey into geographic cult territory. The persistence question, why certain locations feel wrong or haunted regardless of documented history, connects Lovecraftian cult geography to broader phenomenological concerns about how consciousness experiences space and what generates the sense that some places possess qualities beyond their material properties. Environmental psychology research confirms that architectural features, spatial configurations, and environmental factors do influence mood, cognition, and behavior in measurable ways. Certain building designs increase anxiety. Particular landscapes promote calm. Specific sensory inputs trigger discomfort. Yet these scientific explanations often feel inadequate to fully account for places that simply feel profoundly wrong in ways observers struggle to articulate. Lovecraft's cult locations provide narrative explanation for these experiences. The place feels wrong because it is wrong, because past events have contaminated it, because its properties attract or enable cosmic horror. This narrative explanation proves psychologically satisfying even when intellectually rejected, offering interpretive framework that makes inchoate feelings comprehensible. The question of whether such feelings reflect genuine environmental properties, evolutionary adaptations that detect subtle danger cues, cultural conditioning that trains certain responses to specific aesthetics, or simply random psychological noise remains open. Lovecraft's genius was recognizing that regardless of mechanism, the experience of places that feel wrong is widespread enough to support entire fictional mythology. Climate change and environmental transformation introduce new dimension to cult location anxiety through possibility that rising sea levels, extreme weather, and ecosystem collapse might reveal previously hidden sites or create new threshold spaces where cult activity becomes possible. Lovecraft's coastal cult locations gain additional resonance in era of sea level rise. Will warming oceans indeed expose or enable contact with things previously contained by depth and cold? The Antarctic mysteries of At the Mountains of Madness feel less fantastic when contemporary news reports melting ice, revealing ancient organisms, unknown species, and geographic features that had been concealed for millennia. The environmental transformation creates literal thresholds, coastlines shifting, permafrost melting, forests dying, that match Lovecraft's liminal geography where normal boundaries break down. Whether this parallel reflects prescient imagination on Lovecraft's part or simply demonstrates how climate anxiety naturally gravitates toward existing horror frameworks, the convergence makes cult location concepts feel disturbingly relevant to contemporary moment. The possibility that environmental change might reveal cult sites operates as displacement or metaphor for deeper anxiety. That climate transformation will reveal uncomfortable truths about human relationship to planet, about civilization's limits, about species' vulnerability to forces we cannot control and barely comprehend. The mapping compulsion that drives fans to create comprehensive catalogs of cult locations, academic cartographers to map Lovecraft's fictional geography, and tourists to visit sites that inspired stories reveals distinctly human response to horror through taxonomy and documentation. By exhaustively cataloging cult locations, creating databases with geographic coordinates and detailed descriptions, and producing maps showing every reference site, we attempt to master cosmic horror through information management. This represents precisely the anthropocentric response Lovecraft critiqued, the assumption that comprehensive knowledge provides control, that what can be mapped can be managed, yet the compulsion persists because it provides psychological relief, even when intellectually recognized as inadequate. The comprehensive cult location database transforms sprawling narrative threat into bounded dataset, changes unlimited dread into finite list of specific concerns, converts cosmic horror into bureaucratic management problem. Whether this transformation represents healthy coping mechanism or dangerous domestication of genuine concerns remains ambiguous. Perhaps both. We need strategies for managing overwhelming anxiety, but those strategies might prevent adequate response to actual threats by making them seem safely contained when they are not.